My brother punched me in the face right at my wedding. The crowd froze, my jaw felt shattered and blood stained the white lace. Then my husband, a Marine pilot, calmly said, "You just assaulted an officer, face the wall." Ryan was stunned, his career destroyed in seconds. But to understand how my perfect wedding turned into a federal crime scene, you have to know what started it all. Let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to cut off toxic family members to protect your peace. I am Kendra, 35 years old, and a self-made data analytics consultant. Growing up in Atlanta, my parents, Vivian and Jerome, were pillars of our church community. They projected an image of absolute perfection, always dressed in their Sunday best, smiling for the congregation, and serving on every imaginable committee. But behind closed doors, their entire world revolved around one singular person. My older brother, Ryan. He was the golden child, the son who could do no wrong, the heir apparent to a legacy that existed only in my parents' minds. I was the shadow daughter, expected to be quiet, accommodating, and a constant source of financial and emotional support for Ryan's endless mistakes. I built my entire analytics in absolute silence, knowing that if I ever shined too brightly, my family would demand I use my light to warm my brother. The true depth of their toxicity revealed itself at a family Thanksgiving dinner, setting off a chain of events that would end in handcuffs, shattered illusions, and the ultimate destruction of their fake empire. The dining room table was heavy with candied yams, macaroni and cheese, collard greens, and sliced turkey. The smell of cinnamon and roasted meat filled the air, a picture-perfect holiday setup, but the tension in the room was thicker than the gravy. I was sitting quietly sipping my sweet tea and minding my own business when my mother Vivian made her calculated move. She reached into her designer tote bag, pulled out a thick stack of dealership paperwork, and slid it directly over my plate of yams, forcing me to move my hands. "If you really cared about this family, Kendra, you would co-sign this loan. It is just a car." I looked down at the documents. It was a lease agreement for a top-of-the-line luxury SUV complete with premium trim and an exorbitant monthly payment. Across the table, Ryan's wife Ashley let out a dramatic, breathy sigh. As a white woman who had married into our family, she had quickly learned how to weaponize my parents' favoritism and manipulate their desire for social status. She adjusted her posture, smoothing down her expensive blouse, and complained loudly about how her current luxury vehicle was getting so incredibly cramped, especially with her frequent shopping trips at high-end boutiques. She looked at me with that condescending, pitiful smile she had perfected over the years. "We really need the upgrade," Kendra Ashley said, twirling a silver fork in her hands. "And your credit score is so much better than ours right now. Family helps family, right?" I slid the paperwork right back across the polished mahogany table, making sure it stopped perfectly in front of my mother. I did not raise my voice. I did not show a single ounce of the anger boiling inside me. I simply stated the cold, hard facts. My analytics firm does not bankroll Ryan's lifestyle. I am not co-signing a loan for a vehicle you absolutely cannot afford. The silence that followed was deafening. My father, Jerome, frowned deeply, gripping his napkin tightly, clearly offended that I would dare refuse a direct order in his house. My mother gasped, clutching her chest as if I had physically struck her. Ryan, sitting at the head of the table like a king holding court, scoffed loudly. He leaned back in his chair, swirling his glass of expensive bourbon that my father had undoubtedly paid for. "Look at the big shot consultant," he mocked, his voice dripping with absolute arrogance and unearned pride. "You are just bitter because you had to ride the city bus to your little state college while Mom and Dad bought me a brand new BMW for getting into my private university. You have always been jealous of me, Kendra. You think your little spreadsheets make you better than us, but you will always just be the second choice in this house." I looked at my brother. At 38 years old, he was drowning in massive debt, had not held a steady job in a full year, and was relying entirely on our parents to fund his facade of success. I had built my company from absolutely nothing, working 80-hour weeks, while he partied away his inheritance and his potential. I refused to take his bait. I refused to shrink myself to make his fragile ego comfortable. Instead, I reached into my purse, feeling the velvet box resting inside. I have some news, I said calmly, looking directly at my mother, refusing to break eye contact. I am engaged to Julian. I placed my left hand on the table, letting the dining room chandelier catch the brilliant light of the custom diamond ring Julian had given me just 2 days prior. I expected shock. I expected maybe a forced polite congratulations, or at least a fake smile for the sake of the holiday. But the room went completely, utterly dead silent. Nobody smiled. Nobody cheered. Nobody asked to see the ring up close or hear the proposal story. The silence stretched out thick and suffocating, wrapping around my throat. Finally, my father Jerome leaned across the table. He did not look at my face. He grabbed my hand, roughly pulling it closer to inspect the ring. His eyes calculated the carat weight, the clarity, the exact monetary cost. Within seconds, his expression shifted from surprise to predatory, ruthless calculation. Julian, my father said slowly, dropping my hand back onto the table, as if my joy meant absolutely nothing to him. The Marine Corps pilot, the military logistics officer. I nodded, pulling my hand back to my lap, preserving my own dignity in a room designed to strip it away. Yes, Julian, we are getting married next fall. My mother did not ask how he proposed. She did not ask if I was happy or if I was excited about building a life with the man I loved. Instead, she looked at Ryan, her eyes gleaming with sudden, terrifying inspiration, then looked back at me. A military officer with high-level government clearance, Vivian mused, tapping her manicured fingernails against the tabletop. You know, Kendra, your brother has been looking for a breakthrough in his career. With Julian's government contacts and elite military clearance, he could easily secure a lucrative government contracting job. That could really get him out of his slump. You need to introduce them properly and have Julian put in a good word. Set up a meeting next week. I stared at my parents in absolute disbelief. I had just announced the happiest moment of my life, the culmination of my personal joy, and within 30 seconds they had weaponized my fiancé's distinguished military career to serve my unemployed, entitled brother. Absolutely not, I said, my voice cutting through the dining room air with absolute finality. Julian's decorated military career is not a networking tool for a man who has not bothered to update his resume in 12 months. I will not compromise my future husband's integrity to fund your golden child. Ashley immediately burst into tears. It was a performance I had seen 100 times before, a masterful display of manufactured emotion designed to paint me as the aggressive, unfeeling villain. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with fake sobs that instantly drew the sympathy of my parents. How can you be so cruel? Kendra, Ashley wailed, peering through her fingers to ensure my parents were watching her dramatic performance. You are attacking your brother's pride. You are actively trying to destroy our family, just when we need support the most. You have always hated seeing us happy. Ryan slammed his fist on the table, making the fine china rattle and causing my mother to flinch. You are so incredibly selfish, he barked, his face twisting with unhinged rage. This family gave you everything, and the second you get a little bit of power, you hoard it all for yourself. You think this military guy is going to save you from where you came from. You think you are untouchable now. I stood up calmly, smoothing down my dress. I refused to let them see me. Sweat refused to give them the satisfaction of my tears. I picked up my coat and my purse, my movements slow and deliberate. This family gave me nothing but criticism, massive double standards, and impossible expectations. I replied, staring down at the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally. Enjoy your Thanksgiving dinner. I will not be co-signing the loan, and Julian will not be finding you a job. Have a blessed night. As I walked toward the front door, slipping my arms into my coat, I felt a heavy, imposing presence behind me. Ryan had followed me into the narrow hallway, moving quickly to cut off my exit. He leaned in close, blocking my path to the door. I could smell the heavy, sour scent of the expensive bourbon radiating from his breath. He was smiling, but his eyes were cold, calculating, and deeply vindictive. Do not get too high and mighty, little sister, he whispered, his voice a sinister hiss that sent a warning chill down my spine. That little wedding fund of yours could easily clear all my current debts. Mom and Dad will make sure of it. You owe this family, and we always collect what we are owed. I stepped around him, refusing to show a single ounce of fear or intimidation. We will see about that, I said, walking out the door and stepping into the cool Atlanta night air. I felt a profound sense of liberation as I drove back to my own home, gripping the steering wheel tight. But the knot in my stomach told me the absolute truth. I knew my family too well. They never took rejection lightly, and they viewed my money as their emergency fund. The war for my peace, my finances, and my future had just officially begun. 2 days passed without a single phone call from my parents. No apologies for their horrendous behavior. No late congratulations on my engagement. I was sitting in my home office on a quiet Saturday morning, reviewing complex data sets for a major corporate client, trying to lose myself in the comforting logic of numbers. Julian was in the kitchen making us breakfast. He had just returned from a rigorous training deployment, and having his calm, fiercely protective presence in my house felt like a fortress against my family's relentless chaos. Suddenly, my phone chimed with a loud, urgent notification that broke my deep concentration. I picked it up, expecting an email from a client or a calendar reminder. Instead, it was a high-priority alert from my premium credit monitoring application. A hard inquiry had just been placed on my Social Security number. Someone was attempting to open a personal loan in my name for exactly $50,000. My heart hammered against my ribs, a sudden spike of adrenaline flooding my system, but the initial blind panic was instantly swallowed by a cold, burning realization. I knew exactly who it was. I did not scream. I did not break down crying or freeze in shock like the weak victim they desperately wanted me to be. I immediately logged into my financial accounts, securely locked down my credit with all 3 major credit bureaus, and dialed the bank's fraud department to report the unauthorized application. The representative on the phone confirmed my absolute worst suspicions. The application had originated from an IP address in the greater Atlanta area submitted just 15 minutes prior. Fortunately, the loan was automatically declined because of the security freeze I had just initiated. I hung up the phone, taking a deep, steadying breath, and walked into the kitchen. Julian was pouring dark roast coffee into 2 ceramic mugs, moving with the efficient, controlled grace that defined everything he did. He looked up, his sharp eyes instantly reading the rigid tension in my posture and the hard set of my jaw. In his line of work as a military officer, he was highly trained to assess threats in a fraction of a second, and he knew instantly that our perimeter had been breached. "What happened?" Julian asked, setting the coffee pot down deliberately. His voice was deep, steady, and completely grounded, providing an anchor in the massive storm my family constantly tried to create. "Ryan just tried to take out a $50,000 loan using my Social Security number," I said, keeping my voice as level as humanly possible to mask the betrayal stinging my chest. "I froze my credit in time, so the application declined. But he actually did it, Julian. My own brother tried to steal my identity and put me $50,000 in debt just to fund his miserable life." Julian did not yell. He did not act shocked, and he did not offer empty, useless platitudes about how family can be difficult to deal with. His military discipline took over instantly. He wiped his hands on a kitchen towel, walked purposefully over to the island counter, and pulled his secure laptop toward him. He opened it, his strong fingers moving rapidly across the keyboard as he accessed various databases and search tools. He looked at the glowing screen with a cold, terrifying precision that made me realize my brother had messed with the absolute wrong woman and picked a fight with the absolute wrong man. "If he is bold enough to use your Social Security number today," Julian said softly, his eyes scanning lines of data with predatory focus, "what else is he already hiding in the dark? We are not just going to defend you, Kendra. We are going to find out exactly what your brother has been doing, where his money is going, and who else he is defrauding. Let him think he got away with a simple rejected application for now. We are going to dig up every single receipt, and when we strike back, there will be absolutely nothing left of his lies." 2 weeks later, I stood on a circular velvet pedestal in the center of an exclusive bridal boutique in Buckhead. The walls of the salon were lined with imported silk hand-stitched pearls and custom lace. The air smelled of expensive gardenias and chilled champagne. My 2 best friends, Tara and Jasmine, were sitting on the plush white sofa across from me, smiling as the bridal attendant adjusted the sweeping train of my custom-fitted gown. For a fleeting moment, I actually felt a profound sense of peace. The dress was a masterpiece perfectly tailored to my frame, radiating the exact kind of quiet, undeniable power I had spent my entire adult life building. Then the heavy glass doors of the boutique swung open, shattering the calm atmosphere. My mother, Vivian, marched into the salon with my sister-in-law, Ashley, trailing closely behind her. I had specifically not invited either of them to this fitting. I had deliberately kept the date and location off the shared family calendar, knowing exactly how they operated. But Vivian had a network of church gossips at her disposal, and it was only a matter of time before someone leaked my itinerary. Ashley walked in, holding an iced coffee, looking around the high-end boutique with thinly veiled jealousy. She was dressed in an athleisure outfit that cost more than my first semester of college tuition, tapping her phone against her perfectly manicured nails. Vivian immediately took over the room, loudly introducing herself to the boutique staff as the mother of the bride, acting as though she were the one funding this entire operation. I did not step off the pedestal. I looked down at them, my posture rigid, refusing to let them steal the joy of this moment. Tara and Jasmine exchanged knowing, protective glances, setting their champagne flutes down. I must say, Kendra, the dress is a bit much, Vivian announced, circling the pedestal with a critical, examining eye. It is very loud. A bit too aggressive for a woman your age finally settling down. You should have gone with something softer, something more traditional. It is exactly what I wanted, I replied, my voice perfectly level. What are you two doing here? Ashley sighed loudly, stepping forward and dropping her designer purse onto a nearby velvet chair. We came because we need to discuss the reception timeline, Kendra. Ryan and I have been talking, and we realized the date of your wedding falls on the exact same month as our 10-year anniversary. I stared at her, feeling a cold wave of anticipation wash over me. I knew exactly where this was heading. Ryan has been incredibly depressed lately. Ashley continued, her voice taking on that familiar fragile pitch she used whenever she was about to make an outrageous demand. Losing his job has completely destroyed his confidence. He feels like a failure. We realize that your wedding reception is the absolute perfect opportunity to lift his spirits. We have decided that we want to turn the reception into a joint celebration. We want to host our 10-year vow renewal right after you and Julian cut your cake. I looked at her, searching her face for any sign that this was a terrible, tasteless joke. There was none. She was dead serious. She wanted to hijack a reception for 300 guests, paid entirely by me and my fiancé, to celebrate a marriage built on my parents' endless financial bailouts. Vivian immediately chimed in, stepping closer to the pedestal and folding her hands together in a posture of forced maternal warmth. It is a brilliant idea, Kendra. Think about it. All the family will already be there. The catering is paid for, the photographer is booked, and the ballroom is secured. Ryan desperately needs a win right now. He needs to feel celebrated. It would be a beautiful display of family unity if you shared your spotlight with your brother. You know your wedding is far too extravagant for just one couple anyway. The absolute sheer audacity of the request hung in the air of the bridal boutique. My mother was standing in front of my best friends, and the boutique staff asking me to surrender the most important night of my life to serve as a rehabilitation project for my unemployed, fraudulent brother. I did not scream. I did not throw a tantrum. I looked at Ashley, who was standing there with a smug, expectant look on her face, waiting for me to fold exactly the way my parents always forced me to fold when we were growing up. No, I said. The word was simple, sharp, and dropped into the room like an anvil. Ashley blinked, clearly thrown off balance by the absolute lack of hesitation in my response. What do you mean, no? It is just an hour of the reception. We would do our vows, have our own first dance, and maybe a small toast. It will not cost you anything extra. I said, no, Ashley. My wedding is not a charity event for your husband's fragile ego. You will not be renewing your vows at my reception. You will not be having a first dance on my dance floor. If Ryan needs a win, I suggest he updates his resume and attends a job interview. Vivian gasped, her face flushing with immediate defensive rage. Kendra, how dare you speak to your sister-in-law that way? You are being completely selfish. We are trying to keep this family together during a difficult financial time. If you refuse to do this one small thing for your brother, your father and I will simply withhold the funds for your rehearsal dinner. Let us see how you manage paying for a luxury steakhouse dinner for 50 people when we pull our financial support. There it was, the ultimate trump card they always tried to play. Financial leverage. My parents believed that because they had offered to cover the rehearsal dinner, they essentially owned the rights to dictate my entire wedding weekend. They operated under the delusion that I was still the broke college student desperate for their approval and their pocketbook. I looked at the bridal attendant who was standing awkwardly near the mirrors. "Could you please bring the payment terminal over here?" I asked her politely. The attendant quickly walked over carrying the sleek black card reader. I stepped down from the pedestal, the heavy lace of my custom gown trailing beautifully behind me. I walked over to my purse, unzipped the main compartment, and pulled out a thick, sealed banking envelope. I had stopped at my financial institution that morning to make a specific withdrawal, anticipating that my family would eventually try to threaten me financially as the wedding approached. I just did not expect the opportunity to present itself so perfectly today. I opened the envelope and pulled out $15,000 in crisp, banded $100 bills. Vivian and Ashley froze their eyes locked onto the stacks of cash in my hand. The condescending sneers completely melted off their faces, replaced by stunned, breathless silence. I walked over to the boutique counter and placed the banded cash directly next to the terminal. "I am paying for the custom dress, the alterations and the imported veil today," I told the manager, keeping my voice loud enough for the entire salon to hear. "Paid in full. No payment plans, no family contributions." I turned around to face my mother and my sister-in-law. They were staring at the cash as if I had just performed a magic trick. They had spent the last decade assuming my consulting firm was just a minor side hustle, completely underestimating the wealth and power I had accumulated in the shadows. "You can keep your rehearsal dinner money, Vivian," I said, looking my mother dead in the eye. "I do not need a single cent from you, Jerome, or anyone else in this family. I am funding this entire wedding myself. You have absolutely zero financial leverage over me. So let me make this crystal clear so there is no confusion later. Ashley and Ryan will sit in their assigned seats at my reception, they will eat the food I paid for, and they will keep their mouths shut. If anyone attempts to hijack a microphone or make a scene, security will physically remove you from the premises." Ashley looked like she was about to cry, but this time the tears were real. She grabbed her designer purse, her face burning with profound humiliation, and practically ran out of the boutique doors without saying another word. Vivian stood there for a few seconds longer, staring at me with a mixture of horror and cold realization. She was finally looking at a daughter she could not control, could not buy, and could not manipulate. She turned on her heel and followed Ashley out into the Buckhead traffic. I turned back to the mirror, smoothing the delicate lace over my waist. Tara and Jasmine were grinning from ear to ear, raising their champagne flutes in a silent toast. I had won the battle today, but I knew my family. They were cornered, and cornered animals always lash out. I just had to wait for them to make their next move, and unfortunately it came much sooner than I expected. Exactly 1 week after I left my mother and sister-in-law standing speechless in the middle of that bridal boutique, my phone rang. I was sitting at the sleek glass desk in my home office, deeply immersed in predictive modeling for a major corporate logistics client. The house was quiet, filled only with the faint hum of my central air conditioning and the rapid clicking of my keyboard. I had spent the last 7 days enjoying a profound sense of peace, setting a hard financial boundary. With my family had felt like finally exhaling after holding my breath for 35 years. The caller ID on my screen flashed the name of my wedding planner, Sienna. I smiled, reaching for the phone, expecting a routine update about linen swatches or seating chart configurations. I picked up on the second ring. "Kendra, I need you to confirm something right now," Sienna said. Her voice was not carrying its usual cheerful professional cadence. It was strained tight with thinly veiled panic. "Did you authorize your mother to cancel the grand ballroom floral installations?" My hands froze over my keyboard. The temperature in my home office seemed to plummet by 10 degrees. I sat back in my ergonomic chair, my posture instantly rigid. I took a slow, deliberate breath to keep my voice perfectly level. "Sienna," I said, enunciating every single syllable, "I have not authorized any cancellations. Tell me exactly what happened step by step." Sienna let out a heavy breath of relief. Thank goodness. 10 minutes ago, I received a phone call from a woman identifying herself as your mother, Vivian. She sounded incredibly distressed, Kendra. She told me that your family had suddenly encountered a catastrophic financial emergency. She claimed that you were too embarrassed to make the call yourself, so she was stepping in to scale back the wedding immediately. I stared at the blinking cursor on my computer screen, a cold, calculated anger blooming in my chest. My family had zero financial stake in my wedding. They had zero authority to alter my contracts. But they had always operated under the delusion that my life was theirs to manage. What exactly did she try to cancel, I asked. The entire floral package. Sienna replied, her voice steadying now that she knew I was in control. The imported white hydrangeas, the cascading orchids for the head table, the towering centerpieces for the guest tables, and the custom floral arch for the ceremony. The total contract was $20,000. She demanded that I terminate the contract immediately and refund the initial $10,000 deposit. The sheer audacity of the lie was breathtaking. But knowing my mother and knowing Ashley, I knew there had to be a catch. Vivian was obsessed with appearances. She would never actively try to strip a wedding of its luxury unless there was a direct benefit to her or her golden child. And how exactly did she want this deposit refunded? I asked, my analytical mind already connecting the dots. That was the red flag that made me call you, Sienna explained. I told her that any refunds would automatically be credited back to the original card used for the deposit. The caller became very agitated. She insisted that the original credit card had been closed due to the sudden financial crisis. She demanded that the $10,000 be wired immediately to a brand new bank account to help cover the family emergency. She gave me a routing number and an account number over the phone. A dark, heavy silence settled over my office. This was no longer just a case of an overbearing mother trying to sabotage a wedding out of spite. This was an active, premeditated attempt to steal $10,000 of my money. Someone in my family had impersonated me by proxy, attempted to breach a legally binding vendor contract, and tried to divert my funds into their own pockets. Sienna listened to me very carefully, I said, my voice dropping to a tone of absolute authority. The wedding is proceeding exactly as planned. My family has absolutely zero financial jurisdiction over this event. They did not pay for the deposit, and they do not have the power to request a refund. Do not alter a single detail of the floral arrangements. Understood, Kendra. Sienna replied quickly. I will flag your file immediately. We are going to do more than flag a file, I told her. As of this exact second, I am instituting a mandatory verbal password for my entire wedding. The password is Vanguard. Do not accept a single phone call, email, or text message requesting changes to any contract without that specific word. I do not care if someone claims to be me, my mother, or the President of the United States. No password, no changes. I will enforce it right now, Sienna promised. I will email the entire vendor team immediately. Before you hang up, I said, my eyes narrowing at the glowing computer screen in front of me. I need you to read me the exact routing and account numbers that woman tried to give you. Sienna hesitated for a fraction of a second, likely running through her agency liability protocols, but she knew who was signing her checks. She rattled off the 9-digit routing number and the corresponding account number. I typed them directly into a blank spreadsheet, hitting save with a decisive strike of the enter key. Once I disconnected the call with Sienna, I did not waste a single second indulging in tears or emotional breakdowns. I approached the situation exactly like the data analytics consultant that I am. I spent the next 45 minutes conducting a total security lockdown of my wedding. I called the high-end catering company. I called the historic estate venue. I called the string quartet, the lighting technicians, and the photography team. I spoke to every single account manager, informing them of a potential security breach and establishing my strict verbal password protocol. I turned my luxury wedding into a classified operation. Nobody was getting through my perimeter again. Once the vendors were secured, I turned my full attention to the numbers glowing on my spreadsheet. I needed to know exactly where my family was trying to send my money. The first 9 digits represented the routing number. I opened a new browser window and ran a swift query through a public banking database. The routing number did not belong to the massive national bank my parents used for their personal and business checking. It belonged to a smaller regional credit union based in a very specific suburb of Atlanta. A standard personal checking account refund typically involves a simple card reversal or a mailed check. The fact that the caller specifically requested an expedited wire transfer and provided direct routing credentials strongly suggested this was a business account. Someone had set up an LLC to receive the funds quickly and cleanly. I picked up my phone and scrolled through my contacts. During my decade as a consultant, I had built a formidable network of professionals across the financial sector. I found the name I was looking for. Marcus was out of the question, so I called David, a former corporate client who was now a senior vice president of risk management at a major financial institution. We had a great working relationship, and I knew he owed me a favor for a massive data migration project I had streamlined for him 2 years prior. David answered on the third ring with his usual booming enthusiasm. I cut straight to the chase, bypassing the pleasantries. David, I am facing a potential wire fraud situation involving my personal funds, I told him smoothly, projecting nothing but professional calm. Someone attempted to divert a $10,000 vendor refund into an unauthorized account. I have the routing and account numbers they tried to use. I am not asking you to break any privacy laws, but I need you to run a back-channel verification on the routing number. I need to know the name of the business entity attached to this account before I involve the authorities. David instantly shifted into executive mode. Give me the numbers, Kendra. I read them off the spreadsheet. I sat in my home office listening to the muffled sounds of his keyboard clacking through the phone speaker. The minutes stretched out heavy and tense. My mind raced through the possibilities. Was it Vivian trying to funnel my money into her church donation fund to look like a high roller? Was it Jerome trying to cover a bad investment? Finally, David cleared his throat. The line was quiet. Okay, Kendra, I have a hit, David said, his voice lowering significantly. This routing number points to a corporate checking account registered at the regional credit union you suspected. The account is active. What is the name of the entity? I asked, my grip tightening on the phone. The account belongs to a registered limited liability company, David replied. The name on the account is Patriot Vanguard Initiatives. I frowned, staring blankly at the wall. Patriot Vanguard Initiatives. It sounded like a political action committee or a military support group. It certainly did not sound like my parents. David, I said, my voice dropping to a harsh whisper, are you able to see the name of the registered agent on the account? There was a brief pause accompanied by a few more clicks. The registered agent and primary account holder is listed as Ryan. The air vanished from my lungs. The spreadsheet on my screen seemed to blur for a fraction of a second before snapping back into agonizingly sharp focus. Ryan. My unemployed, arrogant, perpetually broke older brother. I was not just throwing a tantrum because I refused to pay for his wife's luxury SUV. He was not just trying to ruin the aesthetics of my wedding day out of petty jealousy. Ryan had systematically orchestrated a premeditated scheme to steal $10,000 of my hard-earned money to line his own pockets and cover his massive debts. He had either convinced our mother to make that phone call to my wedding planner, or more likely, he had Ashley pretend to be Vivian over the phone, weaponizing my mother's name to execute a felony. Thank you, David, I said, my voice completely devoid of emotion. You just saved me a massive headache. I owe you one. I disconnected the call and set the phone face down on the glass desk. A cold, absolute fury settled deep into my bones. Ryan actually believed I was still the quiet, obedient sister who would just sit back and let the golden child take whatever he wanted. He thought I was an easy target. He thought he was smart. He had no idea that he had just handed me the exact weapon I needed to destroy his entire life. I pushed my chair back from the desk and walked to the doorway of my office. Julian was in the living room reviewing flight logistics for his upcoming drill weekend. I did not yell his name or display any panic. I just stood in the doorway and looked at him. He felt my gaze, immediately setting his tablet down on the coffee table and walking toward me. When he stepped into my office, the atmosphere shifted. He could read the absolute stillness in my posture. I gave him the name of the limited liability company David had uncovered. Patriot Vanguard Initiatives. I watched Julian process those 3 words. As a decorated Marine pilot who had actually put his life on the line for this country, his reaction was chillingly quiet. The muscles in his jaw tightened, and a dangerous icy calm washed over his features. He did not ask me if I was sure. He did not ask for context. He just walked around my glass desk, pulled up a chair next to mine, and placed his hands on my keyboard. "Move over," he said softly. "Let us see exactly what kind of war your brother is trying to start." Julian is an officer trained in tactical logistics and intelligence assessment. He knows how to track supply chains, map out enemy resources, and gather actionable data before executing a strike. He brought that exact same military precision to my home office. We did not need to break the law or hack into private servers. Julian knew exactly where to look in the public domain to unearth a digital footprint. He started with the Georgia Secretary of State Business Search Portal. Within seconds, he pulled up the official corporate registration documents for Patriot Vanguard initiatives. I leaned in close to the monitor, reading the stark black text on the screen. The company had been incorporated 11 months ago. That timeline matched up perfectly with the exact month Ryan was fired from his last corporate job. He had not been unemployed and depressed all this time. He had been quietly building a financial scheme. Julian clicked on the filing history. Ryan was listed as the sole managing member and the registered agent. But it was the business classification that made my blood run entirely cold. He had not registered it as a standard consulting firm or a retail business. Ryan had registered Patriot Vanguard Initiatives as a domestic nonprofit corporation. He had officially filed paperwork claiming to be a 501c3 charitable organization. Julian pulled up the statement of purpose attached to the corporate filing. According to the state records, the organization existed to provide financial relief, mental health resources, and transitional housing support for disabled and combat-deployed veterans. A heavy, suffocating silence filled my office. I looked at Julian. He was staring at the screen, his eyes burning with a quiet, lethal intensity. Ryan had never served a day in his life. The closest he ever got to a uniform was playing video games in our parents' basement. Yet he was using the very real struggles of actual military veterans as a shield to commit fraud. It was a level of depravity that went beyond simple financial theft. It was stolen valor, packaged and monetized for his own personal gain. But the scheme went much deeper than a simple state filing. Julian did not stop there. He opened a new tab and began running open-source intelligence searches tracking the name of the organization across social media platforms, community boards, and event registries. He typed in the charity name alongside my parents' names and the name of the massive megachurch they attended in downtown Atlanta. My parents were heavy hitters in their congregation. They sat on the financial steering committees, hosted lavish fellowship dinners, and practically treated the church as their own personal country club. In the African American church community, social capital is currency. If the right family vouches for a cause, the congregation will open their checkbooks without a second thought. Julian hit the enter key and a cascade of search results flooded the screen. My hand flew to my mouth as I read the links. Ryan had not just set up a fake charity in the shadows. He had actively weaponized our parents standing in the church to legitimize it. Julian clicked on a digital newsletter archived on the church website from 3 months ago. The headline announced a highly successful fundraising gala for Patriot Vanguard initiatives. The article featured a high-resolution photograph of Ryan standing at a podium, wearing a sharp-tailored suit, holding a ceremonial novelty check. Ashley was standing right next to him, wiping a performative tear from her eye. My parents were in the front row, beaming with unearned pride. The article detailed how the congregation had rallied behind their golden boy, raising over $40,000 in a single weekend to support our brave men and women in uniform. "He is soliciting donations from the church," I whispered, feeling a wave of absolute nausea wash over me. "He is using mom and dad to bleed their own friends dry. He is exploiting their blind spot," Julian said, his voice flat and analytical. "Your parents want him to be successful so desperately that they are not asking to see any financial disclosures or impact reports. They are just handing him a microphone and a captive audience of generous people." Julian closed the newsletter and continued digging. If Ryan was hosting galas and taking thousands of dollars in donations, he had to have a digital storefront to process the funds. Julian ran a domain registry search and found the official website for Patriot Vanguard initiatives. He clicked the link, and we were immediately taken to a sleek, highly professional web page. The site was perfectly designed to manipulate emotions. It featured high-quality stock images of soldiers returning home families, holding American flags, and paragraphs of emotionally manipulative copy about supporting heroes who had fallen on hard times. There was a massive pulsing red donation button pinned to the top right corner of every single page. I stared at the screen, marveling at the absolute audacity of my brother. He had hired a professional web designer to build an airtight facade. To the average churchgoer or casual donor, it looked entirely legitimate. Julian navigated away from the homepage and clicked on a tab labeled About Us. We read through Ryan's fabricated biography, where he vaguely claimed to be an advocate for military families, carefully avoiding any outright claim of service, while heavily implying an insider connection to the armed forces. Then Julian moved his cursor and clicked on the final tab in the navigation menu. It was labeled Corporate Sponsors and Partners. The page loaded instantly. I stopped breathing. The air in my home office vanished. There, sitting perfectly centered on the screen in massive high-resolution pixels, was the proprietary corporate logo of my data analytics firm. My brand. My hard-earned reputation. The company I had built from absolute scratch, with 80-hour work weeks and relentless dedication. Ryan had stolen my intellectual property and plastered it directly onto the front page of his fraudulent enterprise. Beneath my logo was a paragraph of text written by Ryan. It proudly proclaimed that Patriot Vanguard Initiatives was primarily backed and fully endorsed by my highly successful consulting firm. He had written a fake quote attributing it to me, stating that my company was honored to provide major financial backing to his incredible veteran outreach programs. I was not just stealing $10,000 from my wedding floral budget. He had been stealing thousands of dollars in my name for almost a year. He was using my flawless professional reputation, my pristine creditworthiness, and my corporate standing to legitimize a federal wire fraud scheme. If any donor bank or tax investigator ever decided to look into his charity, the very first thing they would see was my company logo endorsing it. If this charity collapsed, or if the federal government decided to audit the missing funds, my analytics firm could be legally implicated as a co-conspirator. He had essentially tied a financial noose around my neck and linked my livelihood to his felony. I did not cry. I did not scream. The anger that seized my entire body was so pure and absolute that it bypassed raw emotion and transformed immediately into deadly calculated strategy. Ryan had crossed a line that could never ever be uncrossed. He had threatened my business. Julian leaned back in his chair and looked at me. His eyes were dark, serious, and completely locked onto mine. He knew exactly what this meant. He knew the legal ramifications, the potential destruction of my consulting firm, and the absolute disrespect of using his military brotherhood as a pawn for theft. "Do you want to call the police right now?" Julian asked, his voice low and steady. I looked at the fake quote written beneath my stolen company logo. I thought about Ashley demanding a vow renewal at my wedding. I thought about my mother demanding I co-sign a loan for a man who was actively framing me for a federal crime. I thought about my father treating my success like a casual networking tool. "No," I said, my voice echoing with a chilling metallic calm. "If I call the police today, my parents will hire the best defense attorney in Atlanta to protect him. They will find a way to silence the church board, sweep the missing money under the rug, and claim it was just a simple administrative misunderstanding. They will protect the golden child at all costs and blame me for turning him in." I reached forward and placed my hand over Julian's hand resting on the computer mouse. "We are not going to interrupt him while he is making a mistake," I told my fiancé. "We are going to let him keep digging his own grave. We are going to download every single piece of data from this website. We are going to track every state filing, every church newsletter, and every fake corporate endorsement. We are going to build a federal dossier so airtight that not even my parents can buy his way out of it." Julian turned his hand over, lacing his fingers securely through mine. His military training and my data analytics expertise were about to merge into the most devastating counterattack my family had ever seen. And then I said, looking back at the screen, "We are going to hand-deliver that dossier to him exactly when it will destroy him the most." We did not leave my home office for the next 48 hours. I canceled my weekend plans and Julian pushed his military drill preparations to the side. We treated my house like a forward operating base. I ordered takeout, brewed endless pots of black coffee, and fired up every high-powered analytical software tool I had at my disposal. If Ryan wanted to play with data, he was about to learn what happens when you challenge an expert. I ran deep financial traces on Patriot Vanguard initiatives. Using the routing numbers David provided alongside public tax disclosures required for nonprofit organizations, I started mapping the money. In my line of work, numbers always tell a story, and the story Ryan was telling was sloppy, arrogant, and entirely illegal. It did not take long to find the glaring holes in his operation. There were no expenditures for veteran housing. There were no grants issued for mental health resources or transition programs. Every single outgoing wire transfer from the charity account went directly into another limited liability company. It was a shell company registered to Ashley. From there, the money flowed like a river into their personal checking accounts to fund their extravagant lifestyle. Julian sat next to me, meticulously cross-referencing the dates of the church fundraising galas with Ryan's sudden lifestyle upgrades. 3 days after the church congregation donated $40,000. Ashley posted a photo on her social media holding a brand new designer handbag. A week after a targeted email campaign asking for donations to help wounded warriors, Ryan suddenly paid off a massive chunk of his overdue credit card debt. They were funding their fake wealthy lifestyle using the hard-earned money of well-meaning church members. These were people my parents had known for decades, people who trusted our family name. The depth of the betrayal was staggering. Ryan was stealing from elderly church members on fixed incomes who thought they were helping disabled veterans. And he was using my flawless professional reputation as the shield to get away with it. We did not just look at the screen. We printed everything. Every single digital footprint was captured, time-stamped, and stored on a secure external hard drive. We printed the state registry filings showing Ryan as the sole managing member. We printed the screenshots of my stolen company logo on his website. We printed the financial flowcharts I generated highlighting the exact path the stolen church funds took to land in Ashley's personal account. Julian went out and bought a heavy-duty fireproof lockbox and a thick black leather binder. We treated the evidence with the exact same chain of custody protocols Julian used for military intelligence. We slid every piece of paper into clear protective sleeves, creating a physical, undeniable manifestation of federal wire fraud. It was a masterpiece of destruction. Page by page, we built a cage around my brother that he would never be able to escape. By Sunday night, the dossier was complete. I closed the heavy leather cover, feeling a profound sense of dangerous power. My brother had handed me the exact weapon required to dismantle his life, and I had sharpened it to a razor edge. I was ready to drive straight to my parents' house, kick the front door open, and throw the binder onto their pristine coffee table. I wanted to watch Vivian and Jerome realize that their golden child was a federal criminal. I wanted to watch the denial drain from their faces as they looked at the undeniable proof of his theft. I stood up, grabbing my car keys from the glass desk. My blood was running hot, my vision entirely tunneled on confronting them. But Julian stepped in front of the door. He did not raise his voice. He reached out his strong hands, grasping my shoulders, grounding me instantly. "Never interrupt an enemy when they are making a mistake," he said calmly, his dark eyes locking onto mine. I took a sharp breath, the adrenaline fighting against his logic. Julian squeezed my shoulders gently, his military discipline acting as an anchor. "If you march over there right now," Julian explained, his voice perfectly level, "you give them the element of time. You give your parents the chance to hire a crisis management team. You give them the opportunity to liquidate their own retirement funds, pay the money back to the church, and sweep this entire felony under the rug before the wedding. They will hide his crimes, Kendra, and they will blame you for trying to tear the family apart." I stared at him, the harsh truth of his words sinking in. He was absolutely right. Vivian and Jerome cared about their social standing above all else. If I confronted them in private, they would protect Ryan at any cost. They would bury the evidence and turn me into the villain. "We hold the line," Julian continued, stepping back and gesturing to the black leather binder resting on my desk. We wait for maximum impact. We wait until they have absolutely nowhere to run and no shadows to hide in. I slowly set my car keys back down on the desk. The raw, burning anger in my chest began to cool, hardening into something much more calculated and precise. I nodded. We would play the long game. The next morning, I walked out to my mailbox before starting my workday. Tucked between utility bills and junk mail was a thick, cream-colored envelope. The return address belonged to the most exclusive high society country club in Atlanta. I opened the wax seal and pulled out a heavy embossed invitation. It was a formal invitation to my own bridal shower. The hosts listed at the bottom in elegant gold calligraphy were my mother Vivian and my sister-in-law Ashley. The sheer audacity made me laugh out loud right there in my driveway. It was a cold, sharp sound. They were actively trying to steal my identity, funnel my money into a fake charity, and scam my entire business. Yet simultaneously, they were throwing me a high society party to parade me around in front of their wealthy church friends as proof of their perfect, loving family. They wanted to use my upcoming marriage to a decorated military officer to boost their own social currency in the community. I walked back inside the house and tossed the heavy cardstock onto the kitchen counter. Julian was standing by the espresso machine dressed in his physical training gear. He looked down at the invitation, reading the gold calligraphy. "I am throwing it in the trash," I told him, walking past the counter to grab a mug. "I am not sitting in a country club sipping mimosas with women who are actively trying to destroy my life behind my back. I will send them an email declining the event." Julian picked up the invitation, his eyes scanning the details of the venue and the guest list. A slow, chilling smile spread across his face. "No, you are not declining," Julian said softly. He tapped the thick cardstock against the marble countertop. "You are going to go to this bridal shower. You are going to put on your best dress, you are going to drink their champagne, and you are going to play the part perfectly." I stopped pouring my coffee, turning to look at him in disbelief. "You want me to sit in a room with them and pretend everything is fine?" "I want you to let them feel powerful," Julian corrected, his voice dropping to a strategic, commanding tone. "The higher they think they are climbing, the more devastating the fall will be. If you skip this shower, they will know you are onto them. They will get defensive, and Ryan might try to scrub his digital footprint. You have to keep them entirely in the dark. Go to the party, Kendra. Smile for the cameras. Let Ashley make her little passive-aggressive comments. Let your mother show you off. Give them absolutely no reason to suspect that we hold the keys to their destruction." I looked at the black leather binder sitting visible through the open doorway of my office, then back at the elegant invitation resting on the kitchen counter. The contrast between the two was poetic. One represented the fake, beautiful facade my family desperately wanted the world to see. The other contained the ugly criminal truth that would soon tear their entire reality apart. I picked up the invitation and slid it under a magnet on the refrigerator. "You are right," I told Julian, a genuine smile finally touching my lips. "I am going to be the most gracious, radiant bride that country club has ever seen. I am going to let them dig this hole as deep as they possibly can." The following Saturday, I drove my car up the winding, oak-lined driveway of the most exclusive country club in Buckhead. Valets in crisp white shirts rushed forward to open my door. I handed over my keys, smoothed down my tailored ivory crepe dress, and walked into the grand foyer. I was playing a role today, and I was going to deliver a flawless performance. The private dining room was overflowing with the heavy scent of expensive floral arrangements, roasted duck tartlets, and the intoxicating perfume of Vivian's elite church circle. These were the women who ran the congregation, the high society matriarchs, who dictated social standing through silent nods and whispered gossip. My mother was holding court near a towering display of macarons, dressed in a vibrant silk suit that screamed for attention. Ashley was standing right beside her, gripping a highly conspicuous, supposedly rare luxury handbag like it was an Olympic trophy. When I entered the room, Vivian immediately rushed forward, grabbing my arm and pulling me into the center of the crowd. She paraded me around the room, introducing me to women I had known since childhood, as if I were a brand new acquisition she had just purchased. I smiled warmly, shook hands, and accepted their polite congratulations. I played the gracious, radiant bride exactly as Julian and I had discussed. I did not mention my business. I did not mention paying for the wedding myself. I let my mother spin her fictional narrative about our beautiful, tight-knit family. Ashley, however, was visibly vibrating with nervous, hostile energy. She hated that the attention was on me. She hated that the women in the room were complimenting my engagement ring and asking about Julian. She was desperate to reassert her dominance in the family hierarchy, to remind everyone that she was the golden child's wife. About an hour into the shower, the waitstaff began pouring champagne for a toast. Ashley seized her opportunity. She grabbed a silver spoon and tapped it sharply against her crystal flute, demanding the absolute attention of every single woman in the room. The chatter died down. Vivian beamed, stepping back to let her sister-in-law take the floor. "I want to propose a toast to our bride, Ashley," announced her voice artificially sweet, carrying across the silent dining room. When Ryan and I first heard that Kendra was getting married, we were honestly in absolute shock. I mean, we all know how focused Kendra is on her little computer projects. A few of the older church ladies shifted uncomfortably in their seats. I stood perfectly still, my expression a mask of pleasant anticipation. I knew exactly what she was doing. It takes a very special, very brave kind of man to look past all of that. Ashley continued, her smile widening into a predatory smirk. "We just feel so incredibly blessed that Julian came along. Kendra is just so lucky a handsome military man wanted to settle down with a career-obsessed, intimidating black woman like her. We were all starting to worry she would be entirely alone forever." The room went dead. You could have heard a pin drop on the thick carpet. Several women gasped softly, their eyes darting between me and Ashley. The microaggression was not even disguised. It was a blatant racist and sexist insult wrapped in the thin, transparent guise of a wedding toast. She was publicly calling me an aggressive, undesirable burden that Julian was doing a favor by marrying. Vivian did not correct her. My mother simply took a sip of her champagne, allowing the insult to hang in the air, silently endorsing the humiliation. I did not raise my voice. I did not show a single ounce of anger. I remembered Julian's advice. I was dealing with an enemy making a mistake, and I was going to use my analytical precision to dismantle her entirely. I smiled a slow, genuine smile that caused Ashley's smirk to falter. I took a graceful step forward, closing the distance between us. I did not address her insulting toast. Instead, I directed my absolute focus to the handbag she had placed prominently on the gift table for everyone to admire. It was styled to look like an extremely rare, highly coveted French luxury bag, the kind that requires a purchase history of hundreds of thousands of dollars just to be offered the chance to buy it. "Ashley," I said, my voice carrying clearly across the silent room, projecting pure, polite curiosity. "I have been admiring your bag all afternoon. It is truly a striking piece." Ashley instantly puffed up her chest, rising with unearned pride. She thought I was changing the subject out of embarrassment. She thought she had won. "Thank you," Kendra Ashley bragged, projecting her voice so the entire church congregation could hear. "Ryan surprised me with it for our upcoming anniversary. He has such an incredible eye for high-end luxury. It is an exclusive boutique piece. You probably have not seen one in person before." I nodded thoughtfully, stepping right up to the table. I leaned in, examining the bag closely without touching it. "I have a very keen eye for data and details, Ashley. In my line of work, recognizing patterns is everything. And unfortunately, the pattern on this bag is deeply flawed." The room held its collective breath. I could feel the eyes of 50 wealthy, brand-conscious women locking onto the handbag. I pointed gracefully to the stitching along the top handle. For example, the authentic version of this specific luxury piece utilizes a saddle stitch angled slightly upward. It is done entirely by hand, which gives it a distinct asymmetrical tension. This bag features a perfectly straight machine-locked stitch. I moved my finger toward the metal clasp. Furthermore, the hardware here has a brassy yellow undertone. The authentic fashion house uses a proprietary gold plating process that creates a much softer, cooler finish. And if you look closely at the date stamp blind embossed on the interior strap, the font kerning is entirely incorrect for the year of production Ryan supposedly purchased this. I stood back, smoothing my dress, and looked Ashley dead in the eye. My voice remained incredibly sweet, dripping with fake sisterly concern. "I am so sorry, Ashley. I know Ryan has been unemployed for a year and is struggling with massive debt, but it is deeply concerning that someone scammed him into spending his limited funds on a counterfeit bag. You should really have him contact his credit card company to dispute the fraud charge." The silence that followed was apocalyptic. These church ladies knew luxury. They knew wealth. And they knew a devastating read when they heard one. The murmurs started instantly. Women were leaning into each other, whispering behind their hands, their eyes judging Ashley with the ruthless, polite cruelty only Southern high society women possess. Ashley's face turned a violent, blotchy shade of crimson. Her jaw trembled. The illusion of her wealth, her superiority, and her perfect marriage had just been publicly executed in front of the very people my parents desperately wanted to impress. She had tried to humiliate me by attacking my race and my career, and I had destroyed her by attacking the only thing she actually valued, her fake status. Vivian stepped forward, her eyes wide with panic, as she realized the social disaster unfolding in her meticulously planned shower. "Kendra, that is quite enough," she hissed under her breath. "I am just looking out for my brother's financial well-being, mother," I replied innocently. "We would not want anyone taking advantage of him during such a difficult time in his life." Ashley could not take it. A wet, humiliating sob escaped her throat. She snatched the fake counterfeit bag off the table, her hands shaking so violently she nearly dropped it. She did not say a single word to me, to Vivian, or to the guests. She turned on her heel and practically ran out of the private dining room, the heavy country club doors swinging shut behind her. I calmly picked up my champagne flute, turned to the crowd of stunned women, and smiled warmly. "Thank you all so much for being here today to celebrate my upcoming marriage to Julian. Now please enjoy the tartlets." I spent the rest of the shower acting as if absolutely nothing had happened. I ate the expensive food, I thanked the women for their gifts, and I watched my mother frantically try to do damage control, making excuses for Ashley's sudden departure. Vivian avoided making eye contact with me for the rest of the afternoon. She knew I had shifted the power dynamic permanently. 2 hours later, I walked out to the valet stand and handed the attendant my ticket. I felt a profound electric sense of victory. I had not let them break my composure. I had played the game by their rules and beat them flawlessly on their own turf. I slid into the driver's seat of my car, the leather cool against my skin. I pressed the push-to-start button, and my dashboard illuminated. Before I could shift the car into drive, my phone buzzed violently in my purse. I pulled the phone out and looked at the screen. It had been exactly 30 minutes since Ashley fled the bridal shower in tears. The notification on my lock screen was a text message from Ryan. I opened the message. It was not an apology for his wife's racist behavior. It was not a defense of her fake handbag. It was the exact desperate escalation Julian and I had been waiting for. The screen of my phone lit up the dark interior of my car, casting a harsh glow over the leather steering wheel. I stared at the notification banner. Ryan did not bother with a polite greeting. He did not bother trying to hide behind the fake, sophisticated persona he usually wore around my parents. The message was a massive block of text riddled with typos and aggressive capitalization that radiated pure, unadulterated panic. He started by calling me every insulting name in the book, furious that I had exposed his wife in front of the entire country club. He accused me of trying to ruin his marriage and embarrass our family name. But the frantic anger quickly dissolved into desperate, blatant extortion. Ryan explicitly stated that his house was going into active foreclosure at the end of the month. The fake designer bags, the luxury car leases, the tailored suits. It was all a house of cards rapidly collapsing around him. The stolen church donations from his fake charity were clearly not enough to cover the massive hole he had dug for himself. He demanded a cashier's check for $50,000 by Friday at noon. If I did not comply, he promised to completely destroy my wedding. He claimed he had already spoken to Vivian and Jerome. According to Ryan, our parents were completely appalled by my hostile behavior at the bridal shower and were taking his side exactly as they always did. Ryan threatened that unless the funds were transferred into his account by the deadline, all three of them would boycott the wedding ceremony. They would leave my side of the aisle completely empty. But he did not stop there. Ryan knew exactly where my family held their highest social capital, and he aimed straight for it. He threatened to go to the church elders. He promised to stand up at the Sunday service and tell a congregation of 3,000 people that I was a cold, heartless, arrogant woman who abandoned her struggling brother and disrespected her parents. He vowed to launch a full-scale smear campaign within the community, ensuring that my name was dragged through the mud. He wanted to weaponize the very religious community my parents ruled to shame me into submission. He thought the threat of public embarrassment would break my resolve. He thought I was still the quiet, obedient little girl terrified of her mother's disapproval and desperate for a seat at their table. I put the car in drive and pulled out of the country club parking lot. I drove through the affluent, tree-lined streets of Buckhead, feeling absolutely nothing but cold, clinical detachment. Ryan was stupid. In his drunken, panicking rage over his wife's humiliation, he had just handed me written documentation of federal extortion. He had explicitly tied a demand for a massive sum of money to a direct threat against my reputation and my event. I did not cry on the drive home. I did not feel a single ounce of grief for the family I was losing. I only felt the tactical clarity of a general preparing to salt the earth through my front door. Julian was in the kitchen wiping down the marble counters after prepping our dinner. He took one look at my face and knew the enemy had escalated their timeline. I did not say a word. I just unlocked my phone, opened the message thread, and slid the device across the kitchen island. Julian wiped his hands, picked up the phone, and read the massive block of text. His jaw hardened, the muscles ticking beneath his skin. The silence in the kitchen grew heavy and dangerous. Julian is a man who protects his perimeter at all costs, and reading a direct threat against his future wife triggered every single protective instinct he possessed. "This is textbook extortion," Julian said, his voice dropping into a commanding, tactical tone. He just crossed a massive legal line from civil family drama directly into criminal blackmail. If he tries to disrupt your business or your wedding using this threat, it is a felony offense. We have the wire fraud, we have the identity theft attempt, and now we have documented extortion in writing. I took my phone back and immediately took 3 screenshots, ensuring the timestamp and his phone number were clearly visible. I transferred the high-resolution images to my secure network, printed them out in my home office, and walked over to the heavy, fireproof lockbox. Julian followed right behind me. I pulled out the thick black leather binder. I slid the freshly printed screenshots into a clear protective sleeve and snapped it into the metal rings, placing it right behind the bank routing information for his fake veteran charity. The dossier was growing thicker by the day. The trap was fully loaded. Julian leaned against the doorway of my office, watching me secure the lockbox. "How do you want to handle the perimeter?" he asked. "Do we revoke their invitations and lock them out of the venue right now?" I shook my head, turning to face him. Locking them out now gives them the element of time. It gives them the opportunity to play the victim from a distance and spin the narrative to the church congregation before we can drop the hammer. If I cut them off today, Vivian will just throw a pity party, and Ryan will have time to hide his assets. I walked back to my desk and picked up my phone. "I refuse to negotiate with financial terrorists," I told Julian, my voice echoing with absolute certainty. "And I refuse to let them dictate the terms of my engagement. They want to play games with my wedding. We are going to let them walk right into the blast radius." I opened the text thread with Ryan. I did not type out an angry paragraph defending my character. I did not address his ridiculous threats about the church, and I certainly did not offer him a single dime to save his foreclosed house. I wanted him to sweat. I wanted him to spend the next few days obsessively checking his bank account, wondering if his intimidation tactics had worked, waiting for a massive deposit that was never going to arrive. I typed 2 simple sentences, hit send, and locked my screen. "Save your breath. See you at the rehearsal dinner." The rehearsal dinner arrived wrapped in the heavy, humid air of a late Atlanta evening. I walked into the private dining room of the premier steakhouse in Buckhead, wearing a tailored emerald green jumpsuit, my head held high and my posture flawless. Julian walked beside me wearing a perfectly fitted charcoal suit that barely concealed the rigid tactical tension in his broad shoulders. We had invited 50 guests to this exclusive dinner. Half were my fiercely loyal friends and top-tier business colleagues from the analytics world. The other half consisted of Julian's military brothers, a squad of impeccably disciplined officers and logistics experts who commanded absolute respect just by standing in the room. And then huddled in the far corner near the private bar was my family. Ryan was downing a glass of scotch, avoiding my gaze entirely. He looked disheveled, his usual arrogant swagger replaced by a frantic, nervous energy. Ashley looked like a ghost, draped in a designer dress, clearly still reeling from the country club humiliation. Her eyes darted nervously around the room, too terrified to engage in conversation with my highly successful friends. Vivian and Jerome were attempting to work the crowd, pasting on wide, artificial smiles for Julian's commanding officer and my corporate mentors. But I could see the desperate, vibrating anxiety beneath my parents' polished veneer. They were backed into a corner. Ryan's deadline had expired at noon today, and the $50,000 he demanded to save his foreclosed home was nowhere to be found. As the waitstaff began circulating with silver trays of crab cakes and seared beef crostini, I felt a sharp, deliberate tap on my shoulder. I turned to find Vivian staring at me, her smile stretched so tight across her face it looked painful. Kendra, a word she whispered, her voice laced with that familiar commanding edge I used to fear when I was a child. In the corner, now. I did not look at Julian. I did not need to. I felt his physical presence shift instantly, moving right in step behind me, as I followed my mother to a secluded alcove near the heavy oak doors of the wine cellar. Jerome was already standing there, waiting for us. His hands were clasped firmly behind his back, projecting the stern, patriarchal authority he used to run his church committees and dictate our lives. "We need to have a very serious conversation about tomorrow," Jerome said. He did not bother to offer a greeting. He did not congratulate me on the beautiful, expensive dinner I had funded entirely on my own. "Your brother is in a massive crisis, Kendra. His home is on the absolute brink of foreclosure. He came to you for help and you completely ignored his plea." I ignored an extortion attempt. I corrected smoothly, keeping my voice low and pleasant so the guests mingling 10 feet away would suspect absolutely nothing. He demanded $50,000 under the direct threat of sabotaging my wedding day and smearing my name in your church. That is not a plea for help, Jerome. That is a criminal shakedown. Vivian gasped, clutching her pearl necklace in a textbook display of manufactured shock. How can you use such ugly, heartless words about your own flesh and blood? Your brother is terrified right now. Ashley is falling apart at the seams. They are facing absolute ruin, and you are parading around this expensive steakhouse acting like you do not have a single care in the world. You have the money, Kendra. We know exactly how much your consulting firm is making now. My finances are absolutely none of your concern, I replied, crossing my arms over my chest. And my wedding is not a bailout fund for a grown man who refuses to work for a living. Jerome stepped closer, invading my personal space, attempting to use his physical height to intimidate me into submission. This family operates on unconditional loyalty and respect, Kendra. We protect our own. You have deeply disrespected your mother. You humiliated your sister-in-law in front of her peers, and now you are abandoning your brother in his darkest hour. I will not stand by and endorse a daughter who behaves with such profound, calculated selfishness. He paused, letting the heavy, judgmental silence hang in the dimly lit alcove. He was preparing to drop the ultimate weapon. He truly believed he held the nuclear code to my emotional stability. "If you do not wire that $50,000 to Ryan's account by midnight tonight," Jerome stated, his voice dropping to a harsh, unforgiving whisper, "I will not walk you down the aisle tomorrow. Your mother and I will not attend the ceremony. Ryan and Ashley will stay home. We will leave your side of the venue completely empty. You will walk down that aisle alone, and every single person in our congregation will know that your family rejected you because of your cold, unyielding pride." I thought it would break me. He thought the threat of public abandonment, the deep-seated fear of walking down the aisle without a father, would reduce me to the desperate, approval-seeking shadow daughter I used to be. He fully expected me to cry, to beg for his presence, to pull out my phone and transfer the funds, just to save face in front of my high society guests and Julian's military colleagues. I did not shed a single tear. I did not even blink. I just stared at the man who was entirely willing to destroy his daughter's wedding day to protect his son's fraudulent lifestyle. Before I could open my mouth to deliver my response, the air in the alcove fundamentally changed. The temperature seemed to drop to freezing. Julian stepped out from the shadow of the wine cellar doors and positioned himself directly beside me. He did not say a word at first. He simply stood there radiating the absolute terrifying stillness of a combat-trained officer who had just identified a hostile threat targeting his perimeter. His posture was perfectly rigid, his shoulders squared, his expression utterly unreadable. Jerome faltered, taking a half step back. He was highly accustomed to intimidating compliant church members and a daughter he thought he still controlled. He had absolutely no idea how to handle a man like Julian. "Julian, this is a private family matter," Vivian stammered, her voice shaking, as she desperately tried to regain control of the narrative. "We are just having a minor disagreement about family obligations. It does not concern you at all." "Everything regarding my future wife concerns me," Julian said. His voice was not loud. It was not angry. It was chillingly calm, delivered with the flat, authoritative cadence of a military commander issuing a final warning. "And you are not having a minor disagreement. You are actively attempting to blackmail her." "Now see here," Jerome bristled, trying to puff his chest out to reclaim his lost ground. "You might wear a uniform, son, but you do not dictate how I handle my children. I am her father, and I am telling her what is required to maintain her place in this family." Julian did not argue. He did not engage in a shouting match about morality, parenting, or toxic family dynamics. He simply reached inside the breast pocket of his tailored charcoal jacket. His movements were slow, deliberate, and executed with lethal precision. He pulled out a thick, heavy manila folder. It was tightly sealed with a string clasp completely unmarked on the outside. Julian held the folder in his right hand. He looked Jerome dead in the eye, his piercing gaze stripping away every single ounce of my father's manufactured hypocritical authority. Without breaking eye contact for a fraction of a second, Julian extended his arm and slid the heavy manila folder across the pristine white linen of the cocktail table, pushing it directly into Jerome's chest. Jerome stared at the heavy manila folder resting against his chest. He instinctively gripped it, his thick fingers grasping the edges, as if Julian had just handed him a live grenade. For a fraction of a second, his pride fought against his curiosity. He wanted to throw the folder back, to demand respect, to assert his dominance as the patriarch. But the absolute chilling certainty in my fiancé's eyes broke his resolve. Slowly, his hands shaking just enough to be noticeable, Jerome unwound the red string from the circular clasp. Vivian leaned in close over his shoulder, her artificial camera-ready smile completely gone, replaced by a tight, nervous grimace. She knew my analytical capabilities, and she knew Julian's tactical background. Deep down, she recognized that we would not call their bluff without holding a royal flush. Jerome opened the cover. The first document he pulled out was the official notice of default and impending foreclosure on Ryan's home. Jerome scoffed softly, trying to regain his footing and project authority. "We already know about," he muttered, shaking the crisp paper in the dimly lit alcove. "This is exactly why we are telling Kendra to step up. A bank notice does not change her obligation to her brother. We are talking about family loyalty." "Turn the page," Julian instructed. His voice was a flat, terrifying command that stripped away any illusion that this was a negotiation. Jerome flipped the foreclosure notice to the back. Beneath it lay the official Georgia State Registry filing for Patriot Vanguard initiatives. Next to that was a high-resolution printout of the church newsletter, featuring Ryan holding a novelty check, placed side by side with the bank routing information David had verified. And directly below that was the financial flowchart I had meticulously designed in my home office. My spreadsheet was ruthless. It traced every single dollar donated by the elderly members of their congregation. It tracked the funds through the charity's accounts and mapped the direct wire transfers straight into Ashley's personal checking account. I had highlighted the exact dates the church funds were deposited, cross-referencing them with Ashley's social media posts, bragging about her counterfeit designer bags, luxury car lease payments, and expensive spa weekends. Vivian let out a strangled, breathless sound. She grabbed the edge of the paper, her manicured nails digging into the crisp white sheet. She recognized the names of the donors on the accompanying ledger. These were her friends. These were the women she sat with in the front pews every single Sunday. Her own son had used their religious devotion to systematically bleed them dry. The social capital my mother valued above her own life was completely compromised. If this information got out, she would not just be embarrassed. She would be an absolute pariah in the Atlanta church community. Keep reading, Julian said, refusing to allow them a single second to process the shock. Jerome's hands were noticeably trembling now as he uncovered the final document in the stack. It was a formal, heavily researched draft of a federal indictment. Julian had consulted his military legal contacts to ensure the terminology was flawless. The document explicitly detailed the charges of federal wire fraud, identity theft, and the exploitation of military service members for financial gain, commonly prosecuted as stolen valor. It outlined the exact prison sentences associated with each felony charge. The air completely evaporated from my parents' lungs. The illusion they had spent 38 years protecting the narrative that Ryan was a brilliant, misunderstood success dissolved right in front of their eyes. They were not looking at a son who just needed a little financial help. They were holding undeniable federal proof that their golden child was a high-level criminal who had conned their entire community and attempted to implicate my business in the process. Jerome's shoulders slumped. The imposing, towering figure of the strict church elder collapsed into the posture of a defeated, terrified old man. He looked up at Julian, his mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. "You are not going to issue any more threats tonight," Julian said, his voice dropping to a low, lethal register that echoed with absolute authority. "You are not going to demand a single cent from my future wife. You are going to listen very carefully to your new rules of engagement. You have exactly 24 hours until the wedding ceremony begins. You, Vivian, Ryan, and Ashley are going to show up to the venue on time. You are going to sit in your assigned seats in the back row. You are going to smile brightly for the cameras, and you are going to keep your mouths entirely shut." Julian took a slow step forward, forcing Jerome to back up against the heavy oak doors of the wine cellar. "If you attempt to cause a scene," Julian continued, his tone absolute iron. "If you try to approach Kendra privately, to manipulate her, or if you decide to boycott the ceremony, to make a statement about your wounded pride, this folder does not just go to the local police. It goes directly to the federal authorities. It goes to the fraud division of the Internal Revenue Service. And most importantly to you, it gets hand-delivered to every single elder on your church board. Your congregation will know exactly who robbed them, and they will know you tried to cover it up to save face." I stood next to Julian, feeling a profound, untouchable peace settling deep into my bones. For the first time in my life, I was not terrified of my father's anger or my mother's judgment. I was looking at two people who had vastly underestimated the woman they had raised in the shadows. "You thought you held the leverage because you threatened to leave my aisle empty," I told them smoothly, projecting a quiet, radiant power. "You thought the threat of public abandonment would break me. But you do not own the building anymore, Jerome. You do not get to dictate the terms of my life. You will play the part of the happy, supportive family tomorrow, because if you do not, your entire social and financial existence burns to the ground. You are going to witness my success, and you are going to stay absolutely silent while it happens." Across the crowded dining room, through the gap in the alcove archway, I saw a sudden erratic movement. Ryan had been hovering near the private bar for the last 30 minutes, steadily downing top-shelf scotch on my dime. The heavy alcohol had fueled his underlying panic, stripping away his inhibitions and leaving nothing but raw, desperate paranoia. He had been watching our private huddle in the alcove. He saw Julian hand over the unmarked folder. He saw the color completely drain from Vivian's face. He saw Jerome's chest cave in total catastrophic defeat. Ryan knew. Even through the thick haze of the liquor, his survival instincts kicked in, telling him the secret was out. The $50,000 was not coming. The fake charity had been exposed. The stolen church funds were documented. His safety net was gone, and his parents were powerless to save him. The golden child was finally cornered, and the realization entirely broke his mind. He did not retreat in shame. He exploded in rage. Ryan let out a visceral, unhinged scream that shattered the elegant ambiance of the upscale steakhouse. He grabbed the edge of a high-top cocktail table covered in crystal glassware, heavy silverware, and full bottles of expensive red wine. With a violent, desperate heave, he flipped the entire table into the air. Glass shattered across the polished hardwood floor in a deafening, explosive crash. The dark wine splattered against the pristine white walls like blood. The ambient music seemed to stop immediately. The 50 guests in the room, my corporate mentors, my fiercely loyal friends, and Julian's highly disciplined military squad all froze in absolute shock, turning to witness the destruction. "You owe me!" Ryan screamed at the top of his lungs, his face twisted in a mask of drunken, furious entitlement. He kicked a broken chair out of his way, charging directly across the dining room toward the alcove where we stood. "You owe this family." Ryan closed the distance between us in seconds, a hulking mass of blind, intoxicated rage. His fists were balled, his face twisted into an ugly mask of unearned entitlement. He was screaming my name, completely oblivious to the room full of elite corporate executives and highly trained military personnel watching his every move. He truly believed he could physically intimidate me into submission, just as he had bullied his way through our entire childhood. I thought I was still the vulnerable little sister who would flinch, cower, and apologize for making him angry. I did not flinch. I did not even take a step back. Before Ryan could close the final 3 feet between us, Julian moved. It was not a chaotic scramble or a sudden panicked reaction. It was a fluid, terrifying display of pure martial discipline. Julian stepped directly in front of me, placing his body as an impenetrable shield between my brother and my physical space. Ryan swung a wild, clumsy fist, aiming blindly for Julian's face. Julian did not throw a punch in return. He did not need to. He simply raised his left forearm, effortlessly deflecting the heavy blow, and simultaneously stepped into Ryan's guard. With a surgical, mechanical precision, Julian grabbed Ryan's right wrist, twisted it sharply behind Ryan's back into an agonizing joint lock, and used my brother's own reckless momentum against him. Julian drove Ryan downward, forcing him to his knees before slamming him face first onto the nearest empty dining table. The heavy oak table groaned under the impact but held firm. Ryan gasped, the wind completely knocked out of his lungs, his cheek pressed hard against the crisp white linen. Julian placed his forearm against the back of Ryan's neck, applying just enough downward pressure to entirely immobilize him. Julian did not break a sweat. The tailored seams of his charcoal suit jacket did not even stretch. "Stand down," Julian commanded. His voice was not raised yet. It carried a lethal, absolute authority that echoed off the mahogany walls of the private dining room. For a second, the room was suspended in complete silence. Julian's military brothers, who had instantly risen from their chairs the moment the glass shattered, stood at the ready. They were waiting for a single nod from Julian to swarm the table and physically remove the threat. But Julian had total control of the perimeter. Ryan struggled weakly against the hold, groaning in pain, but he was pinned like a helpless insect. Then the silence was shattered by a piercing, hysterical shriek. "Look what you are doing to him!" Vivian screamed. My mother pushed past Jerome, scrambling in her designer heels toward the table where her golden child was pinned. She did not look at me to see if I was safe. She did not check to see if Julian was injured. She reached out her hands, hovering uselessly over Ryan's back, tears of sheer panic streaming down her face. "Let him go, you animal!" Vivian shrieked at Julian, though she was smart enough not to actually touch a highly trained combat officer. She turned her furious, tear-stained face toward me, her eyes burning with a venom so toxic it practically poisoned the air between us. "This is your fault, Kendra," Vivian yelled, pointing a shaking finger directly at my chest. "You are destroying this family. He is sick with stress. He is losing his home, and you are standing there letting your thug of a fiancé assault him. You orchestrated this entire evening just to humiliate us. You are a cold, selfish, miserable daughter, and you are tearing us apart." There it was, the ultimate classic gaslighting maneuver. My brother had just flipped a table covered in glass, charged across a crowded room, and attempted to physically assault me because his federal charity fraud had been exposed. Yet in the warped, delusional reality of my mother's mind, I was the villain. I was the aggressive instigator who had somehow forced poor innocent Ryan to commit wire fraud and throw a drunken tantrum. A year ago, that accusation would have wounded me deeply. I would have felt the familiar heavy crush of guilt. I would have scrambled to de-escalate the situation, apologizing for setting boundaries, desperately trying to prove that I was a good, loving daughter. But tonight, looking at the frantic, hysterical woman pointing her finger at me, I felt absolutely nothing. The last remaining thread of my emotional attachment to these people cleanly and permanently snapped. I was immune. Vivian, I said, my voice cutting through her hysteria with a calm, freezing resonance. Your son is a federal criminal who just attempted to assault a Marine officer in a room full of witnesses. If you say one more word to me, I will have the restaurant manager call the Atlanta police and Ryan will spend the night before my wedding sitting in a holding cell. Vivian's mouth snapped shut. The threat of police of public arrest of a mugshot making its way through her church congregation instantly neutralized her fake outrage. She swallowed hard, her eyes darting nervously around the room, finally registering the disgusted expressions of the high society guests and corporate executives watching her family's absolute meltdown. Jerome finally stepped forward, his face pale and glistening with nervous sweat. He looked at Julian, raising his hands in a gesture of total surrender. Please, Jerome whispered, his voice stripped of every single ounce of the patriarchal authority he had tried to wield in the alcove. Please let him up. We will leave. We will take him home right now. Just let him up. Julian held the lock for 3 agonizingly long seconds, ensuring Jerome fully understood who held the absolute power in this dynamic. Then, with a swift, fluid motion, Julian released Ryan's arm and stepped back, returning to my side. Ryan scrambled back from the table, gasping for air, clutching his wrist. He did not look at me. He did not look at Julian. The alcohol-fueled rage had completely evaporated, replaced by the terrifying, sobering reality of his circumstances. He stumbled backward, nearly tripping over a broken chair. Ashley, who had been hiding near the bar, rushed forward and grabbed his arm, her face buried against his shoulder to hide from the staring crowd. Julian smoothed his tie and looked at my father. The bill for this dinner is already paid, Julian stated coldly. The damage to the venue will be billed directly to the credit card you have on file. You have your instructions for tomorrow, Jerome. Do not make me repeat them. Jerome gave a stiff, humiliated nod. He grabbed Vivian by the elbow, physically steering her away from me. The 4 of them, the golden child, the enabling parents, and the complicit wife, shuffled toward the heavy oak doors. They kept their heads down, navigating through the wreckage of shattered crystal and spilled wine they had created, looking exactly like the broken, fraudulent cowards they truly were. Julian and I did not stay to watch them clean up the mess. We turned to our guests, who had remained incredibly respectful and composed during the entire ordeal. I apologize for the disturbance, I announced to the room, projecting a warm, unbothered smile that proved my spirit remained entirely intact. Please enjoy the rest of the evening, the open bar, and the dessert service. Julian and I will see you all tomorrow for a much more joyous celebration. My corporate mentors offered reassuring nods, and Julian's military brothers raised their glasses to us in a silent show of absolute solidarity. We turned and walked out of the private dining room, our heads held high. We strode through the main restaurant, leaving the chaos, the manipulation, and the toxic gaslighting behind us. We stepped out the front doors into the humid Atlanta night, where the valet had already brought Julian's sleek black sedan to the curb. The drive home was quiet, wrapped in the comforting, secure silence that only exists between 2 people who completely trust each other. I leaned my head against the leather passenger seat, watching the blurry glow of the city streetlights pass by the window. The adrenaline was finally beginning to fade from my bloodstream, leaving behind a deep, profound sense of finality. The war was over. The boundary had been drawn in wet concrete, and my family was trapped on the other side of the wall. I turned my head slightly, looking at Julian. His profile was illuminated by the dashboard lights, his jaw relaxed, his hands resting easily on the steering wheel. He had not just protected me from physical harm tonight. He had protected my peace. He had systematically dismantled the people who had terrorized my emotional state for decades. Do you think they will even show up tomorrow? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper in the quiet cabin of the car. After all of that, after the humiliation, the folder, the physical takedown, do you think they actually have the nerve to walk into that venue and sit in the back row? Julian kept his eyes on the dark road ahead. A slow, chilling smile touched the corners of his mouth. They will show up, Julian replied softly. He reached across the center console, taking my hand and lacing his fingers securely through mine. Narcissists can never resist a crowd. The sun rose over Atlanta, painting the skyline in brilliant shades of gold and amber. I woke up on the morning of my wedding day feeling an absolute, unshakable sense of tranquility. There were no nervous jitters. There was no anxiety about seating charts, vendor schedules, or floral deliveries. The perimeter was entirely secured. My bridal suite at the historic estate was filled with the soft sounds of jazz and the quiet, efficient movements of my styling team. Tara and Jasmine handed me a glass of sparkling water, their eyes shining with fierce pride as they watched the process. When the stylist zipped up my custom lace gown, the transformation was complete. I looked in the floor-length mirror and saw a queen. The heavy ivory silk draped perfectly over my curves, and the cathedral-length veil trailed behind me like a shadow of pure power. I did not look like the overlooked, burdened daughter today. I looked like the architect of my own empire. The string quartet began playing a soaring classical arrangement as the heavy oak doors of the garden courtyard swung open. The afternoon air was crisp and fragrant with the scent of the white hydrangeas and cascading orchids I had successfully protected from my mother's sabotage. 300 guests rose to their feet. The front rows were packed with my loyal corporate mentors, my sorority sisters, and a formidable wall of Julian's military colleagues looking immaculate in their pristine dress blues. And then way in the back, sitting in the very last row, exactly as Julian had commanded, was my biological family. I did not have a father to walk me down the aisle. Jerome was sitting in the back row, trapped by the weight of a federal dossier, his patriarchal pride utterly shattered. I gripped my bouquet of white orchids, squared my shoulders, and walked myself down that aisle. Every step I took was a declaration of absolute independence. I glided past the rows of high society church members who had known me since childhood. They whispered in awe, completely unaware of the explosive hostage situation playing out in the back of the venue. I kept my gaze locked on the altar. As I passed the final row, I allowed myself a single brief glance to my left. Vivian, Jerome, Ryan, and Ashley were sitting shoulder to shoulder, looking like prisoners of war. They wore stiff, agonizingly fake smiles, for the roaming photographers terrified that a single scowl would trigger the release of their criminal records to the church board. Vivian's hands were clenched so tightly in her lap, her knuckles were white. Jerome stared straight ahead, his jaw locked in rigid humiliation. Ashley looked miserable in a muted beige dress, completely stripped of her usual arrogance and fake luxury, and Ryan looked like a caged animal. I turned my head forward and never looked back at them again. Julian was waiting for me at the end of the aisle. He looked breathtaking in his uniform, the medals on his chest gleaming in the afternoon sun. When I reached him, he took my hands in his dark eyes radiating absolute devotion and unwavering protection. We exchanged our vows under the floral arch my mother had desperately tried to cancel. We sealed our marriage with a kiss, and the crowd erupted in thunderous, joyful applause. We walked back down the aisle together as a unified, impenetrable front. The transition to the grand ballroom for the reception was flawless. The energy in the room was electric, vibrant, and completely intoxicating. The catering staff moved seamlessly through the crowd with silver trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvres. The lighting technicians had transformed the venue into a golden, glowing sanctuary. Our friends and colleagues laughed loudly, filling the space with genuine, unadulterated joy. Julian's squad commanded the dance floor, their sharp military uniforms creating a striking contrast against the flowing evening gowns of my bridesmaids. It was the exact opposite of the cold, emotionally barren household I had grown up in. I was surrounded by my chosen family, people who celebrated my light instead of trying to extinguish it. True to their orders, my family did not cause a scene during the formal dinner service. They sat at their assigned table in the far corner of the ballroom, completely isolated from the joy radiating through the rest of the venue. They ate the expensive catering I had paid for, and they spoke to absolutely no one. The wealthy church elders they usually tried to impress were seated at the premier tables near the dance floor, completely out of their reach. Vivian could not network. Jerome could not brag. They were effectively quarantined in their own toxic misery, completely neutralized by the threat of exposure. I sat at the sweetheart table with Julian, enjoying a meal I had earned through years of relentless hard work. The speeches from the bridal party were heartfelt and hilarious, filled with stories of my professional grit and Julian's unwavering loyalty. For the first time in my 35 years of life, I did not spend a single second worrying about managing my parents' emotions or shrinking myself to accommodate my brother's fragile ego. But as the evening progressed and the formal dinner gave way to the high-energy reception, I noticed a shift in the perimeter. The live band started playing an upbeat set, drawing the majority of the guests to the center of the room. Julian was pulled into a brief conversation with his commanding officer near the edge of the dance floor. I took a sip of my water and let my analytical gaze sweep across the ballroom to check the layout. That was when I saw him. Ryan had abandoned his assigned seat at the quarantine table. He was standing alone at the open bar near the heavy glass terrace doors. I was not talking to the bartender. He was not mingling with any of the guests. He was just drinking. I watched him throw back a neat glass of whiskey, slam the crystal tumbler onto the polished mahogany bar top, and immediately gesture for another pour. The bartender complied, looking slightly uncomfortable with my brother's aggressive, sloppy demeanor. Ryan grabbed the second glass, but he did not look down at the amber liquid. His eyes were locked dead on to me from directly across the crowded ballroom. The heavy alcohol consumption was stripping away the paralyzing fear Julian had instilled in him the night before. The stark terror of the federal dossier and the foreclosure notices was being drowned out by cheap liquid courage, leaving behind nothing but pure, unadulterated, toxic hatred. I could read the exact calculation happening in his desperate, ruined mind. He had spent his entire life taking whatever he wanted, shielded from consequences by our enabling parents. He simply could not compute the reality that his sister had bested him, outsmarted him, and trapped him. He gripped the whiskey glass so tightly his knuckles turned pale. He was a ticking time bomb running purely on drunken entitlement and bruised pride, and the countdown had just reached 0. The reception was in full swing, bathed in the warm amber glow of the crystal chandeliers suspended high above the polished dance floor. The catering staff had just cleared the main courses, quietly slipping away with empty plates of seared filet and roasted asparagus. The ballroom was settling into that comfortable, joyous lull that precedes a night of heavy dancing and celebration. Julian's best man, a fellow Marine captain named Terrence, stood near the edge of the head table. Terrence looked immaculate in his dress blues, holding a crystal flute of champagne. He was halfway through a deeply moving toast, speaking eloquently about Julian's absolute loyalty, his tactical brilliance, and the formidable partnership we had built together over the years. The 300 guests were completely captivated, laughing at the right moments and raising their glasses in quiet, respectful agreement. I sat next to Julian, my hand resting comfortably over his on the crisp white linen of the sweetheart table. Everything was proceeding with the flawless precision we had planned. The energy in the room was vibrant, safe, and filled with genuine love. Then a jarring physical disruption shattered the elegant harmony of the ballroom. From the far side of the venue, near the heavy glass doors of the terrace, Ryan began his march. He did not simply walk across the room. He shoved his way aggressively through the pristine maze of guest tables. He stumbled heavily, his shoulder knocking hard into a server carrying a tray of empty water glasses. The glasses clattered together loudly, drawing the immediate sharp attention of the high society church elders seated nearby. Ryan ignored the disruption entirely, his eyes completely bloodshot, his face flushed with the toxic combination of top-shelf whiskey and absolute desperation. I was sweating through his tailored suit, his tie loosened and hanging crookedly around his neck. The polished, arrogant golden child facade was entirely gone. He looked like exactly what he was, a cornered, panicking fraud who had just realized his entire reality was collapsing around him. Julian felt the shift in the room's energy instantly. I felt his hand tighten over mine. His posture shifted from a relaxed groom to a high-alert military officer in a fraction of a second. Terrence noticed the commotion too, pausing his toast and lowering the microphone slightly, his military training causing him to assess the rapidly approaching threat. Before anyone could step in to intercept him, Ryan reached the edge of the dance floor. He did not ask to speak. He did not wait for Terrence to finish his tribute. Ryan lunged forward aggressively, his heavy hand closing over the microphone and physically snatched it right out of Terrence's grip. A sharp, agonizing screech of audio feedback blasted through the ballroom's state-of-the-art sound system. Several guests winced, covering their ears. The ambient chatter of 300 people died instantly, replaced by a suffocating, deeply uncomfortable silence. Julian started to rise from his chair, his jaw locked and his eyes narrowing, but I placed my hand firmly on his forearm. I squeezed twice, signaling him to hold his position. I did not want Julian to silence my brother. I wanted the entire room to witness exactly who Ryan was. I wanted my parents sitting in their assigned quarantine table in the far back corner to watch their prized investment detonate his own social standing in front of their wealthy congregation. Ryan stood in the center of the dance floor, swaying slightly on his feet. He gripped the microphone with both hands, bringing it close to his mouth. When he spoke, his voice was thick, heavily slurred, and dripping with raw venom. "You all think she is so perfect," Ryan barked into the microphone. The sound echoed harshly off the high ballroom walls. "You sit here in your fancy dresses and your perfectly pressed military uniforms, drinking her expensive champagne, thinking my little sister is some kind of brilliant, generous queen. You think she is a massive success story." The silence in the room was absolute. Nobody moved. The high society churchwomen, the corporate executives, and the disciplined Marines just stared at the sweaty, unhinged man holding the event hostage. "She is an absolute fraud!" Ryan shouted, his voice cracking with misplaced rage. "She is the most selfish, cold-hearted, ungrateful daughter to ever walk the earth. Our parents gave her everything. This family gave her everything. And what does she do the second she gets a little bit of money and power? She turns her back on her own blood. She leaves her family to completely drown." I kept my expression perfectly neutral. I did not look away, and I did not look embarrassed. I just watched him dig his own grave. From the corner of my eye, I could see Vivian and Jerome in the back row. My mother had both hands clamped over her mouth, her eyes wide with sheer, unadulterated terror. The wealthy church elders she had spent decades trying to impress were now sitting front and center, listening to her son publicly confess that their perfect family was drowning. Jerome was gripping the edge of his table so hard his knuckles were entirely white, paralyzed by the sheer public humiliation of the moment. They could not stop him. The federal dossier Julian had handed them the night before bound them to their seats. They were forced to sit there and watch their legacy burn to the ground. "My house is going into active foreclosure," Ryan yelled, pointing a shaking finger directly at me. His complete lack of self-awareness was staggering. He was actively destroying his own fabricated image of wealth in front of the very people he had scammed. "My wife is falling apart. We are losing everything we have, and my sister will not lift a single finger to save us. She is sitting up there in a custom gown, while her own brother is about to be thrown out on the street." Low murmurs began to ripple through the crowd. They were not murmurs of sympathy for Ryan. They were murmurs of deep, profound disgust. The wealthy executives and the disciplined military officers recognized a pathetic, entitled shakedown when they saw one. "She owes me," Ryan demanded, his voice echoing with absolute delusion. He stumbled forward a half step, the microphone picking up his heavy, ragged breathing. "She owes this family. You want to show everyone how rich and successful you are, Kendra. You want to prove you are better than us. Then prove it right now. I want a check. I want a check for $50,000 written out to me before this reception continues one more minute. You have the money. Write the check and save your family right now, or you are nothing but a selfish traitor." I was trying to leverage public pressure to extort me. He genuinely believed that if he caused a massive enough scene in front of my high-tier guests, I would fold. He thought the threat of extreme public embarrassment would force me to open my checkbook just to make him go away quietly. He thought he was backing me into a corner. He had no idea I owned the entire building. I did not break eye contact with my brother. I did not reach for my purse. I did not say a single word in my own defense. I simply shifted my gaze past Ryan, looking over his shoulder toward the elevated sound booth at the back of the massive ballroom. The DJ, a highly professional vendor I had hired specifically for his ability to read a room, was standing behind his mixing board. He looked horrified by the aggressive disruption, his hands hovering uncertainly over the volume sliders, waiting for direction from the bride who had paid his invoice in full. I caught the DJ's eye. The moment our gazes locked, I raised my right hand. Keeping my face completely devoid of emotion, I extended my index finger and drew it slowly and deliberately in a horizontal line right across my own throat. The DJ did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. He killed the main audio feed. The heavy booming amplification of Ryan's voice vanished instantly. The sudden absolute silence in the massive ballroom was deafening. Ryan did not immediately realize what had happened. He kept shouting into the microphone, his mouth moving aggressively, his face turning an even deeper shade of red. But the only sound that carried was the pathetic, weak echo of his raw voice dying in the vast open space of the venue. He sounded incredibly small. He tapped the microphone against his palm. He shouted into it again, demanding that the audio be turned back on, but his raw voice could barely project past the first row of tables. The high society women from my parents' church, the ones who had coddled and praised him, his entire life, were now staring at him with undisguised pity and disgust. The elite military officers sat with perfectly straight postures, their eyes tracking his erratic movements with professional calculating discipline. They were not looking at a man demanding respect, they were monitoring a volatile threat. Ryan looked down at the dead piece of equipment in his hand. He looked at the silent, judging faces surrounding him. Then he looked at me. I was still sitting peacefully next to Julian, entirely unbothered by his desperate display. I was not the scared little sister shrinking under his shadow. I was the one pulling the strings, cutting his audio, and closing out his account. The realization hit him with the force of a freight train. I had taken his voice. I had taken his money. I had taken the very foundation of his unearned superiority and dismantled it in public. He was completely, utterly powerless, and he knew it. Something dark, desperate, and incredibly dangerous snapped in Ryan's mind. The public humiliation combined with the heavy alcohol and the absolute destruction of his financial extortion scheme pushed him over the edge of rational thought. He could not manipulate me. He could not steal from me. He could not outsmart me. So his broken, frantic mind defaulted to the only tactic he had left: physical violence. Ryan dropped the dead microphone. It hit the polished wood of the dance floor with a dull, heavy thud that reverberated in the quiet ballroom. His eyes locked onto mine, burning with a frantic, unhinged, and totally unrestrained hatred. He let out a raw, guttural sound of pure, uncontrollable rage. He kicked a low floral arrangement completely out of his path, lowered his broad shoulders, and charged directly across the dance floor, sprinting straight toward the head table. Ryan cleared the polished hardwood of the dance floor in mere seconds. He was not a trained fighter. He was a desperate, humiliated man running purely on whiskey and a collapsing ego. He moved with the chaotic, reckless momentum of someone who had never faced a single real consequence in his entire 38 years of life. The high society guests scrambled frantically out of his path. Crystal champagne flutes shattered against the floor as someone knocked over a tall cocktail table in their haste to get out of the blast radius. I did not stand up. I did not flinch, and I did not raise my hands to protect my face. I sat perfectly still at the sweetheart table, watching the physical manifestation of my family's toxicity barrel directly toward me. Julian moved. He did not shout a warning. He did not adopt a traditional aggressive fighting stance. He simply shifted his weight and stepped slightly ahead of my chair, positioning his broad shoulders to intercept the incoming threat. But Ryan was swinging blindly, his heavy arm arcing through the air with absolutely no precision or aim. Julian blocked the brunt of the attack with his forearm, taking a heavy strike directly against the brass buttons of his dress blue uniform. But the wild, chaotic momentum of Ryan's swing carried through the block. The back of Ryan's knuckles glanced hard against the side of my face. A collective, horrified scream erupted from the 300 guests. The impact was a sharp, jarring explosion of pain that snapped my head to the side. The metallic, bitter taste of copper instantly flooded my mouth. My jaw throbbed with a hot, radiating intensity. I touched my trembling fingers to the corner of my lip. A single distinct drop of dark red blood fell from my chin, landing directly on the pristine custom white lace of my bridal bodice. It was the final definitive stroke of disrespect. My brother had actually struck me at my own wedding reception. Julian did not blink. The second Ryan's fist made contact, Julian's demeanor shifted from a protective groom to an active-duty combat officer, eliminating a hostile threat. He did not throw a punch. He did not lose his temper or shout in rage. He moved with terrifying surgical precision. Before Ryan could even pull his arm back for a second swing or realize what he had just done, Julian's left hand shot out. He clamped down onto Ryan's wrist with the crushing, inescapable force of a steel vise. Julian pivoted sharply on his heel, using Ryan's own drunken momentum entirely against him. He twisted Ryan's arm upward and violently behind his back, locking the shoulder joint into an agonizingly restrictive hold. Ryan let out a choked, breathless gasp of pain, but Julian gave him absolutely zero time to recover, maintaining the brutal joint lock. Julian drove Ryan forward, marching him rapidly past the edge of the head table. With a swift mechanical thrust, Julian slammed Ryan face first into the heavy marble-clad structural pillar of the ballroom. The sickening thud of Ryan's face hitting the cold marble echoed over the gasps of the terrified crowd. Julian pressed his forearm firmly into the back of Ryan's neck, pinning him completely and instantly against the stone. Ryan's legs kicked uselessly against the floor, his expensive suit jacket riding up around his ears, his face mashed aggressively against the column. He was entirely neutralized in less than 4 seconds. The ballroom fell into a profound, suffocating silence. The music was already dead. Nobody moved. The wealthy women from my parents' church were clutching their pearls in genuine, unadulterated terror. The corporate executives from my analytics firm stood frozen, watching a high-level, violent physical altercation unfold at a luxury reception. Julian did not look at me to check if I was crying. He knew I was not. He kept his forearm locked against Ryan's neck and turned his head slightly to address the room. His voice did not echo with anger. It echoed with absolute, devastating authority. "You just assaulted an officer," Julian said. The words rang out clear and sharp in the dead-silent ballroom. Ryan groaned against the marble, trying to formulate a defense. But the reality of Julian's words hung in the air like a heavy executioner's axe. Julian had deliberately stepped into the trajectory of the attack. Ryan had not just struck a bride. He had thrown a physical punch that connected with an active-duty Marine Corps pilot in full military dress uniform. It was a severe, unpardonable federal offense. At those exact words, the perimeter instantly shifted. Julian did not need to issue a verbal command to his squad. The military police officers who had been invited as guests, men who had served alongside Julian in combat zones and logistics command centers, immediately mobilized. They moved out from their tables in perfect, silent unison. Terrence, the best man, set his champagne flute down on the nearest table. Within seconds, 4 highly disciplined men in formal military attire swarmed the pillar. They took over the physical hold from Julian, securing Ryan's arms behind his back with practiced, inescapable efficiency. Someone produced a set of heavy tactical zip ties, binding Ryan's wrists together tightly behind his back. Julian stepped back, smoothing the lapel of his dress blues. He looked down at his own uniform, brushing a speck of dust from his medals, projecting total, absolute control over the environment. He then turned his dark, penetrating gaze across the vast expanse of the silent ballroom, looking directly past the shocked faces of my friends and mentors. His eyes locked dead onto the back corner table. Vivian had collapsed back into her chair, her hands trembling violently over her mouth. Jerome was standing up, his face a sickly ashen gray, watching his golden child being detained and bound by military police. Ashley was frozen in her seat, her eyes wide with a horrific, dawning realization that her lavish lifestyle was evaporating right in front of her. They thought the nightmare was over. They thought Ryan's arrest for assault was the catastrophic climax of the evening. They were entirely wrong. Julian stared directly at my mother, my father, and my sister-in-law. The silence in the room was so absolute that his next words felt like they were being broadcast over a loudspeaker. "He is not just being detained for assault," Julian announced, his voice slicing through the heavy air with chilling finality. "He is also being taken into federal custody for wire fraud." The collective gasp that rippled through the room was monumental. The church elders, who had been sitting near the front of the dance floor, turned their heads rapidly toward the back quarantine table. Whispers ignited like wildfire through the ranks of the congregation. The phrase federal custody carried a weight that shattered the very foundation of my family's carefully curated hypocritical image. Julian remained standing tall, the ultimate protector and strategist. The evidence we had meticulously gathered, the financial spreadsheets, the state registry filings, the screenshots of the fake veteran charity, had not just been a threat to keep them quiet during the ceremony. Julian had already forwarded the entire airtight dossier to his contacts within the federal investigative authorities hours before the rehearsal dinner even began. The trap had been set long before we walked down the aisle. Ryan's violent outburst had simply provided the perfect, indisputable reason to detain him on the spot and hand him over to the authorities waiting outside the venue gates. I remained seated at the head table. I reached up with a crisp white linen napkin and gently blotted the small cut on the corner of my mouth. I looked down at the drop of blood staining the delicate lace of my bodice. It was not a mark of defeat. It was a badge of absolute victory. My brother had tried to break me, and in doing so, he had handed us the absolute, undeniable justification to permanently destroy his freedom and his future. The military police officers did not handle Ryan with the gentle coddling deference my parents had always afforded him. They hoisted him off the marble pillar, securing the heavy tactical zip ties around his wrists with sharp, unforgiving efficiency. The moment the cold, thick plastic bit into his skin and locked his arms securely behind his back, the reality of the situation finally pierced through his whiskey-soaked brain. The arrogant, entitled golden child vanished completely. In his place was a pathetic, terrified man, realizing that for the first time in 38 years, nobody was going to bail him out. He started sobbing. It was not a quiet, dignified surrender. It was a loud, ugly, hyperventilating panic. He dragged his feet against the polished hardwood of the dance floor as the officers marched him toward the main exit. He twisted his neck, his face flushed and streaked with tears, looking desperately toward the back corner of the ballroom. Mom, Ryan wailed, his voice cracking into a high pitch of absolute desperation. Dad, do something. Call a lawyer. Do not let them take me. While Ryan was being hauled through the center of the reception, Ashley made her move. I watched her from the sweetheart table, tracking her erratic, panicked movements. She was not crying for her husband. She was calculating her own survival. She knew her name was listed as the primary beneficiary on the shell company accounts, where the stolen church donations had been funneled. She saw her luxury vehicle lease her counterfeit designer handbags and her entire suburban socialite identity evaporating into thin air. Ashley abandoned her clutch on the table, kicked off her expensive heels to move faster, and sprinted toward the heavy glass doors leading to the outdoor terrace. She thought she could slip out the back, call a rideshare, and vanish into the Atlanta night before the authorities realized her level of complicity. She pushed the heavy glass door open, but she did not even make it past the threshold. Two local law enforcement officers, who had been coordinating with Julian's federal contacts outside the venue perimeter, stepped directly into her path. They did not draw their weapons, but their physical presence was an absolute brick wall. One officer held up a hand instructing her to step back inside. He stated firmly that they needed to ask her some very specific questions regarding her corporate banking history and her knowledge of wire fraud. Ashley collapsed against the glass door frame, sliding down to the floor. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking as her entire world officially ended. At the quarantine table. In the back of the room, the ultimate collapse of my parents' empire was happening in real time. Vivian had spent her entire adult life orchestrating a flawless, highly curated image of wealth and religious superiority. She had just watched her son be arrested for federal fraud in front of the very church elders she desperately wanted to impress. The social capital she valued above her own daughter was completely, irreparably destroyed. Vivian stood up, her hands clutching the edges of the table, her breath coming in short, rapid gasps. Her eyes rolled back into her head and she collapsed. It was not one of her calculated performative swoons designed to manipulate an argument. It was a genuine physiological shutdown. She hit the carpeted floor with a heavy thud. Jerome did not even attempt to catch her. The imposing authoritarian patriarch stood absolutely frozen. His broad shoulders were slumped, his arms hanging uselessly at his sides. He was staring at the empty space where his golden child had just been dragged away in restraints. He looked like a hollow, empty shell of a man. Everything he had built, everything he had sacrificed his morals to protect, had just been incinerated. Julian stepped back to my side at the head table. A caterer rushed forward, pressing a white linen napkin wrapped around a handful of ice into my hand. I took it, pressing the freezing compress against my throbbing jaw. The pain was sharp, but it grounded me. I stood up from my chair. The ballroom was completely silent, every eye watching my next move. I walked slowly and deliberately across the dance floor, moving through the space where my brother had just assaulted me. I did not stop until I was standing directly in front of the quarantine table. A few guests had rushed over to fan Vivian, who was slowly blinking her eyes open, groggy and disoriented on the floor. Jerome finally pulled his gaze away from the doors and looked at me. His eyes were red, filled with a horrific mixture of devastation and pleading. He opened his mouth, perhaps to beg for mercy, perhaps to ask me to call off the federal authorities. I did not let him speak. "You made your choice," I said. My voice was completely devoid of anger, sorrow, or sympathy. It was an absolute freezing void. You chose the fraud. You chose the golden child. You chose to sit back and watch while he tried to destroy my business, steal my money, and assault me at my own wedding. Vivian scrambled to a sitting position, reaching a trembling hand out toward the hem of my custom lace gown. "Kendra, please," she sobbed, her pristine makeup completely ruined. "We are your family." I took a deliberate step backward, ensuring her fingers grasped nothing but empty air. "No," I read, staring down at them with total, unshakable finality. "You are simply the people who gave me my genetics. As of this exact second, you are completely dead to me. Do not call my phone. Do not show up at my home. Do not ever attempt to contact me or my husband for the rest of your lives. If you violate this boundary, I will unleash every single piece of evidence I have left directly to the media." I turned my back on them and walked back to Julian. He was waiting for me at the edge of the dance floor, his posture tall and commanding. He gave me a single affirming nod. He raised his hand and signaled to the venue's private security team, who had been standing by the perimeter walls. "Escort them off the property," Julian commanded. The security guards moved in instantly. They helped Vivian to her feet and directed Jerome toward the side exit. My parents did not fight back. They did not argue or attempt to cause another scene. They walked out of the ballroom with their heads bowed in absolute crushing defeat, escorted off the premises like common trespassers. The heavy wooden doors closed behind them with a definitive, satisfying thud. The toxic elements had been completely and permanently removed from my perimeter. Tara and Jasmine flanked me the moment the heavy oak doors closed behind my parents. They did not offer empty pity or ask if I needed to cancel the rest of the evening. They knew me far better than that. They immediately ushered me into the private bridal suite adjacent to the grand ballroom. Jasmine wet a clean white cloth with chilled club soda, gently and meticulously dabbing at the singular drop of blood that had stained the custom lace of my bodice. Tara pulled out her professional cosmetic kit, applying a cold jade roller to my jaw before expertly blending a layer of high-definition foundation to completely mask the faint rising redness on my skin. I sat in the plush velvet chair looking at my reflection in the wide vanity mirror. My jaw throbbed with a dull, persistent ache, but my spirit was completely untouched. Ryan wanted to break me. He wanted to ruin the most expensive, beautiful night of my life, because he was fundamentally incapable of building a successful life for himself. I refused to give him the satisfaction of my tears. I refused to let his desperate, violent tantrum become the defining memory of my wedding day. I looked at Tara and Jasmine, my brilliant, fiercely loyal sisters, who had stood by me through grueling college exams and brutal corporate promotions. They were the women who had celebrated my very first analytics contract and wiped my tears during the hardest days of building my firm. I told them I was ready to go back out there. They smiled warmly, touching up my lipstick and perfectly adjusting the placement of my cathedral veil. Julian was waiting for me in the hallway outside the bridal suite. He did not look like a man who had just dismantled a physical threat. He looked exactly like the man who loved me, his dark eyes radiating pure, unadulterated admiration and absolute devotion. He offered his arm and I took it securely. We did not sneak back into our own reception through a side door. We walked through the main archway with the absolute undeniable confidence of a king and queen returning to their throne. The moment we stepped back into the ballroom, the atmosphere completely transformed. The shock and tension that had temporarily gripped the room instantly evaporated. Our guests, my high-powered corporate mentors, my beautiful, successful friends, and Julian's impeccably disciplined military brothers rose to their feet. They did not whisper or stare in uncomfortable silence. They erupted into a massive, deafening wave of applause. They were clapping for our resilience, our strength, and our absolute refusal to be victimized by toxic bloodlines. I caught the DJ's eye across the room. He gave me a sharp, respectful nod and instantly dropped the needle on an upbeat, heavy brass track that vibrated right through the polished hardwood floorboards. The bass line hit and the entire room surged toward the dance floor. The energy shifted from stunned silence to absolute, undeniable triumph. Terrence and the rest of Julian's squad formed a protective, joyous perimeter around us. They laughed, clapped, and celebrated with a fierce, unwavering loyalty that my biological family could never comprehend. I danced with my husband in the center of the room. I looked around at the radiant, smiling faces of the people who had actively chosen to be in my life. This was my real family. We shared no genetics, but we shared absolute mutual respect, undeniable support, and genuine love. My corporate colleagues toasted to my continued success, completely unbothered by the dramatic exit of my parents. The older church ladies who had stayed behind nodded at me with profound respect, their eyes communicating a silent understanding that the ugly truth about Vivian and Jerome had finally been brought to the light. The catering staff brought out late-night gourmet sliders and fresh beignets, keeping the energy incredibly high and the guests fully satisfied. We drank top-tier champagne, we took hundreds of photographs in the photo booth, and we danced until our feet literally ached inside our formal shoes. It was a flawless, triumphant victory. The toxicity had been surgically removed from the premises, leaving behind nothing but pure, unadulterated joy. The night did not end in a tragedy. It ended in a spectacular, unforgettable celebration of the empire we had built and the peace we had fiercely protected. I had reclaimed my narrative, my venue, and my joy. I looked at Julian under the warm glow of the chandeliers and knew I had made the greatest choice of my life. The morning after the wedding, Julian and I boarded a first-class flight to the Maldives for a 3-week honeymoon. I turned my phone entirely off. I did not check my emails. I did not look at social media, and I did not waste a single second thinking about the wreckage I had left behind in Atlanta. I swam in crystal-clear waters, ate incredible local food, and rested in the profound security of my new marriage. I slept soundly, knowing my perimeter was completely secure and my future was incredibly bright. But while I was resting on a tropical beach, the federal government was working. Fast forward exactly 6 months. The emotional dust of the wedding day had completely settled. The physical bruises had faded, the thank you notes had been mailed, and Julian and I had settled perfectly into our new life together. My analytics firm was thriving, but the relentless grinding wheels of the federal legal system had not stopped turning. Ryan thought the worst part of his punishment was being humiliated and detained at a wedding reception. He had absolutely no idea what a federal indictment actually looked like. The federal justice system moves with a cold mechanical efficiency that does not care about a mother's tears or a father's church titles. The dossier Julian and I compiled was an absolute fortress of undeniable evidence. When the federal prosecutors presented the bank routing records, the fake state registry filings, and the digital footprint of the stolen donations, Ryan's expensive defense attorney advised him to take a plea deal immediately. There was no highly publicized trial for Vivian and Jerome to attend. There was only a swift, brutal sentencing hearing in a federal courthouse. Ryan was convicted of multiple counts of wire fraud and exploiting military charities. He was sentenced to 72 months in a federal correctional institution without the possibility of early parole. The arrogant golden child was stripped of his tailored suits, his top-shelf whiskey, and his unearned pride, reduced to nothing but an inmate number in a high-security facility. Ashley did not stand by her husband. The very second federal agents froze their bank accounts and seized the counterfeit designer bags she had purchased with stolen church funds, her superficial loyalty completely evaporated. She realized the federal government was actively looking into her role as the beneficiary of the shell company. In a desperate, selfish bid to save herself from being indicted as a co-conspirator, she turned over every piece of financial documentation the investigators requested and immediately filed for divorce. Stripped of the fraudulent income and alienated from my parents, Ashley was left with absolutely zero assets. The condescending suburban socialite who had tried to humiliate me with racist microaggressions at a country club was forced to move back into her tiny childhood bedroom at her parents' house. She now works a minimum wage retail job at a local boutique, forced to fold clothes for the exact same high society women she used to desperately try to impress. The devastation of my parents was total and absolute. They refused to accept that their golden child was a criminal, convinced they could somehow buy his way out of federal prison. Vivian and Jerome liquidated their entire retirement portfolios. They took out massive high-interest secondary mortgages on their pristine suburban home to pay for Ryan's defense team. When the plea deal was struck and the legal fees drained their final accounts, the bank foreclosed on their property. But the financial ruin was nothing compared to the social execution they faced. The elders at their massive Atlanta megachurch received a full briefing on the federal indictment when the congregation realized that Vivian and Jerome had actively facilitated a charity scam, pushing their wealthy friends to donate thousands of dollars to line Ryan's pockets. The backlash was apocalyptic. There was an emergency board meeting. My parents were summoned and publicly confronted. Vivian tried to cry, attempting to spin the narrative that they were just victims of a misunderstanding, but the church board showed absolutely no mercy. The excommunication was swift and permanent. My parents were publicly cast out, stripped of their committee titles, and banned from the congregation. Their social capital was reduced to ash. They currently live in a cramped, poorly insulated apartment on the outskirts of the city, completely isolated from the community they valued far more than their own daughter. While their world collapsed into dust, my empire expanded exponentially. The exposure of my family's toxicity at the wedding did not damage my professional standing in the slightest. The corporate executives and industry leaders who attended my reception had witnessed my ability to handle catastrophic high-pressure situations with total grace and absolute tactical control. Word of my analytical precision spread through the corporate sector. Within 3 months, my firm secured 3 massive, multi-year government contracts. Our annual revenue tripled, allowing me to hire a dozen new analysts and expand into a stunning corporate office space in Midtown Atlanta. Julian and I are thriving in a powerhouse partnership built on absolute trust, mutual respect, and fierce protection. His military command formally recognized his flawless leadership, promoting him to a higher logistical tier. We operate as a completely unified front, moving through our careers and our marriage with a profound, unshakable security. We do not tolerate drama and we do not entertain disrespect. I step out onto the expansive wrap-around balcony of our new custom-built home. The evening air is warm, carrying the sweet scent of jasmine from the gardens below. The city skyline glitters in the distance, a sprawling network of lights and infinite possibilities. I hold a crystal glass of sparkling water, leaning my arms against the smooth glass railing, and I reflect on the brutal, beautiful journey that brought me to this exact moment. I spent over 3 decades of my life shrinking myself to make my family comfortable. I dimmed my own light, silenced my own voice, and repeatedly compromised my peace in a desperate, exhausting attempt to earn a seat at their table. I believed the lie that blood bound me to their dysfunction. I look back through the sliding glass doors into the massive, warmly lit living room of my own house. Julian is sitting on the plush sofa, reviewing a flight manual, looking up to give me a slow, reassuring smile that makes my heart completely steady. I realize now the most vital truth I have ever learned. True power is not about fighting for validation from people who are committed to misunderstanding you. True power is not begging for a seat at a toxic, broken table. True power is walking away entirely. It is about buying the whole building, locking the abusers out, and resting in the profound, unbreakable peace that you built with your own 2 hands. The greatest lesson I learned is that blood does not automatically equal family. For years, I believed I had to shrink myself to earn love from people who were fundamentally committed to misunderstanding me. But true family is not built on manipulation, guilt, or conditional approval. It is built on mutual respect, fierce protection, and genuine support. Walking away from toxic relatives is not a sign of weakness. It is the ultimate act of self-preservation. You cannot heal in the same environment that broke you. True power is having the courage to lock the abusers out and build a beautiful, peaceful life entirely on your own terms. Have you ever had to walk away from toxic relatives to protect your own peace? Let me know in the comments below and subscribe for more empowering stories.